Ukraine just hit something big in Russia. Something irreplaceable that was located 1,000 miles away. Putin thought that Ukraine would never be able to do something like this. He was wrong. In the most significant surgical strike of the war so far, Ukraine has ignited the lifeblood of Putin's military machine. And all Putin can do is watch it burn, as Russia can't stop the fire that Ukraine is raining down upon it. To find out what happened, we have to head to Gubaka, which is in the Perm region of Russia. That region, which is nestled near the Ural Mountains and situated along the banks of the Kama River, is located on the European part of Russia. It should be well out of Ukraine's range. Gubaka itself is a 1,600-kilometer or 994-mile journey from Ukraine. Perhaps that's why Putin thought that one of his most important chemical-producing facilities would be safe there. Even as news broke that Ukraine was developing and using long-range drones capable of traveling that distance, Putin must have thought that air defenses located at one of Russia's most vital chemical plants would be enough to stop Ukraine. Putin was wrong. On February 17th, United 24 media reported that Ukraine had pulled off a surgical strike against the Metafrax chemical site in Gubaka. Explosions and a fire have been reported at the site, which is believed to produce a wide range of chemicals that are used in the production of explosives. Among those chemicals are urea, urotropine, and pentaerythritol, all of which United 24 media says could be used as precursors for the explosives with which Russia has been pelting Ukraine from the moment that Putin launched his invasion. The Astra Telegram channel offers a little more insight, along with several photographs of the plant, one of which shows a large fire that has been sparked by Ukraine's long-range drones. Those drones would have had to travel an enormous distance, bypassing Russian air defenses as they did, and there may well be a secret technique that Ukraine used to pull the strike off. We'll expose that technique later in the video, as it's a stroke of genius that may explain why Ukraine has enjoyed so much success with its deep strike strategy over the last few months. But returning to the Astra report, the Telegram channel says, Astra previously reported, citing a subscriber and local residents' social media posts, that at least 4 drones struck the Metafrax chemical plant, causing a fire. Plant employees were sent to a bomb shelter. As per usual, Russia's defense ministry is pretending that nothing happened. Astra says that the ministry has reported the downing of 4 of Ukraine's drones over the Perm region, which just so happens to be the same number of drones that eyewitnesses say scored direct hits on the plant. Business Insider adds that Russia is claiming to have shot down 334 of Ukraine's fixed-wing drones over the 24 hours leading up to the strike. We all know where this is going. Russia is going to claim that Ukraine's drone debris did all of the damage. How many times are we going to have to hear that tired old excuse for strikes that clearly landed exactly where Ukraine intended them to land? The same Telegram channel also offers more insight into the chemicals that the Metafrax plant produces. Beyond the 3 already mentioned, the plant makes methanol and hexamine, which are also key components used for the manufacture of explosive weapons. Formalin and synthetic resins are also made at the plant, suggesting that it may have some commercial purposes along with its military slant. If that's the case, then Ukraine's strike is a 2-for-1 in the sense that it deprives both Russia's military and its people, thus delivering yet more pain to a country that thought it would never have to deal with Ukraine attacking it on its own territory. Speaking of 2-for-1 strikes, there's a second surgical strike that Ukraine pulled off at around the same time as the Metafrax attack. Stick with us because we'll reveal it all in a couple of minutes. In Business Insider's reports on the strike, it points out that the plant that Ukraine struck was already sanctioned, suggesting that Ukraine may have attacked because the sanctions weren't doing enough to stop plant operations. The same outlet also points out that Metafrax isn't any old producer of methanol. It's actually one of the largest in all of Russia and Europe. A Security Service of Ukraine or SBU source is also quoted by Business Insider as saying, "The destruction of such objects reduces the pace of ammunition production, complicates the supply of resources for the army, and directly affects the reduction of the intensity of hostilities against Ukraine. There's your reason for Ukraine's attack." This strike, like so many before and those that will come after, is part of a systematic campaign by Ukraine to destroy the military-industrial facility that Russia depends upon to prop up Putin's invasion. When facilities like Metafrax burn, pressure on Ukraine is relieved. And when there's less pressure, Ukraine can get down to the important business of destroying as many Russian invaders as possible. We've just mentioned the SBU. That may give you a clue as to who conducted this latest surgical strike. If you guessed the SBU's Alpha unit, then give yourself a pat on the back. The unit, which has become one of Ukraine's most effective in the deep strike arena, has been wreaking havoc on Russia for well over a year. In 2025 alone, the Alpha unit destroyed $4 billion worth of Russia's air defenses. It's easy to see why. Every air defense system that the unit takes down is a system that can't guard the skies over Russia's key facilities. It's not a huge stretch to suggest that the attack on Perm's chemical plant was made possible by the Alpha unit destroying the defenses that guarded the hundreds of miles of territory its drones would have to fly over to reach the plant. And once those drones arrived, they delivered their payloads with deadly efficiency. Remember, there's a secret technique that Ukraine may have used to carry out this 1,000-mile strike. But before we get to that, we told you earlier that the Perm strike wasn't the only one that Ukraine carried out that has shut off Russia's war lifeblood. Also on February 17th, Business Insider reported that Ukraine had managed to score direct hits with its drones on a key Black Sea oil terminal in what amounts to yet another attack designed to ignite the most important resource that Russia has for funding its war in Ukraine. Business Insider reports that Ukraine's drones managed to score hits on the Tamanavtogas oil terminal, which is in Russia's Krasnodar region. That alone would be big news, but the fact that this terminal is located in what the outlet calls one of the largest ports that Russia has in the Black Sea region is an indicator that the air defense destruction campaign launched by Ukraine last year has worked. Such a vital port has to be protected. Russia needs that port to ship its illicit oil to the dwindling number of nations that are willing to buy it. If Ukraine is conducting successful strikes against such crucial pieces of equipment as the Tamanavtogas oil terminal, that means Russia's air defenses are now worn so thin that they are either incapable of stopping Ukraine's drones or they simply aren't there to do the job because Russia has to prioritize where they go. Either way, it's a win for Ukraine. It means yet more deep strike attempts will be successful. Ukraine has actually proven that, as the February 17th attack on the Tamanavtogas facility is the second such strike that Ukraine pulled off in less than a month. On January 22nd, a similar attack led to several tanks and pipelines at the terminal being destroyed, with later assessments determining that Ukraine had caused an estimated $50 million in losses. Whether those losses were caused by Russia losing oil that it intended to sell, repairing equipment that Ukraine damaged, or both, isn't specified by Business Insider. What we do know is that Ukraine managed to cause plenty more damage to the terminal in the latest attack. But before we dig into that, there's a lot more where this came from. If this sort of insight is what you crave, make sure you're subscribed to The Military Show. New Sky has more details about the damage done to the Tamanavtogas facility. It says that Ukraine's strike caused a fire in the terminal area of the facility, which has been confirmed by both the SBU and open-source intelligence outlets that reported on the strike. Shipping data has also been revealing, the outlet notes, as there has been a reduction in tanker traffic from the Tamanavtogas site in the wake of Ukraine's attack. The logic here is that few tankers heading out means there's less oil available to load into those tankers. It doesn't take a genius to put two and two together to realize that the oil that was meant to head out on those tankers is the same oil that is now in flames due to Ukraine's drones. New Sky adds that insurance companies are also reviewing the rates they offer to ships that dock in Russia's Black Sea ports. That claim was confirmed by Reuters in January, which reported that rates had already jumped for ships sailing in the region after unidentified drones struck a pair of Greek-managed oil tankers in the Black Sea region. Those strikes led to war insurance costs jumping to 1% of the value of the ship from previous rates of 0.6% and 0.8% in December 2025. Those are the highest rates seen since 2023, and they're another indicator that bad things are happening to Russia's ports and tankers in the Black Sea. What we're seeing with all of this is Ukraine's plan paying dividends. Each strike against Russia's Black Sea oil logistics is designed to inflict as much pain as possible. The most obvious form of that pain comes from the money that Russia loses directly. Burning oil can't be sold, and damaged terminals have to be repaired before they can be used again. However, it's the underreported long-term damage caused by things like insurance rate hikes that also sting Russia. Remember that Russia is operating a massive shadow fleet of ships to sail its oil out of the country. When the state has to pay more for insurance to keep those ships running, that amounts to more money lost from the Russian war purse. We can even link some estimated figures to the strategy. According to Ukrainian shipping magazine, Russia had spent about $14 billion on a fleet of just over 400 tankers for its shadow fleet by May 2025. That means that Russia has been getting its aging tankers for about $35 million each. Let's use the percentages that we mentioned earlier. 0.6% of $35 million is $210,000. Whereas 1% is $350,000. The difference caused by the January rate change is $140,000 per ship. Multiply that by 400 ships and you get a $56 million hole burned into the Russian war budget due to insurance hikes alone. Russia has been feeling the pain in its Black Sea ports for a while now. Back in December, oilprice.com reported that Russian shipments of refined oil products had fallen by 0.8% in November when compared to the previous October. That decline came on the back of a Ukrainian strike against the port of Novorossiysk, which also led to a massive slump in fuel exports from Russia's Black Sea and Azov Sea ports. A 30.2% month-on-month collapse was recorded in that area, all of which contributed to Russia's total oil exports dropping by about 420,000 barrels per day in November 2025. We've mentioned the word systematic several times in the video. This is what systematic means. Every single strike that Ukraine pulls off against facilities like Tamannaftagaz and the Metafrax chemical plant causes both direct and indirect damage that keeps on siphoning money out of the pot that Putin is increasingly struggling to keep at a large enough level to wage his war against Ukraine. With less money comes far weaker assaults on Ukrainian territory, which goes a long way to explaining things like Russia losing a staggering 31,700 soldiers in January alone. Those soldiers have fewer weapons and insufficient equipment because Ukraine's deep strikes both reduce the amount that Russia can spend to equip its soldiers and, as was the case with the Metafrax strike, take away the weapons that Russia needs to sustain its assaults. And these long-range strikes may be being pulled off because Ukraine has come up with a genius method to circumvent Russia's remaining air defenses, allowing it to get its drones closer to their targets before they're sent to deliver their explosive payloads. We mentioned this secret strategy earlier in the video, and it can be summed up in one word: balloons. On February 17th, the New Voice of Ukraine reported that Ukraine has started using military balloons to deliver its drone strikes into Russian territory. These balloons have several uses. Reconnaissance is among them, which is no surprise, given that balloons have been used for that purpose for decades. However, Ukraine is also using balloons to transport cargo as decoys and to directly carry out strike operations. This is a brilliant strategy because balloons overcome many of the problems that Ukraine's drones face. Balloons aren't vulnerable to the same electronic warfare tricks that send drones astray, such as GPS jamming, and they're often far more difficult to detect on radar than drones. The approach has enabled strikes deep inside Russian territory, including oil fields, refineries, shipping terminals, and rail infrastructure, putting pressure on Russia's economy, the outlet states. Ukraine has even been able to take advantage of the prevailing winds in the country, which are easterly and naturally blow the balloons into Russian territory. Throw artificial intelligence into the mix, which Ukraine is using to predict weather and wind patterns, and you get a devastating combination of old and new that is causing major problems for Russia. The New Voice of Ukraine says that these balloons can fly higher than drones and fighter jets, potentially putting them out of the range of air defenses. They're also loaded with solar panels, allowing long periods of operation, along with sensors and cameras that likely contribute to their ability to autonomously adjust their course. So maybe not so old after all, more like a new and interesting strategy to attain air superiority that Russia can't seem to counter. Now, we don't know if Ukraine used military balloons in either of the strikes we've covered in this video, but it's possible. For the Metafrax strike, balloons may have helped Ukraine's strike drones navigate through denser Russian air defenses that are in and around Ukrainian territory before those balloons release their drones to fly the rest of the way to the poorly guarded chemical plant, for instance. Looking beyond Ukraine's surgical strikes, there are a few things that we can deduce from what Ukraine did leading up to February 17th. One of those things is something that we've already mentioned. Ukraine isn't slowing down in its systematic campaign to destroy Russia from the inside. Both of the strikes we've covered cost Russia money and weaken the country's military directly or otherwise. This is death by 1,000 cuts, and Ukraine just inflicted a pair of massive slices that have Russia bleeding out the oil and chemicals that are the lifeblood of Putin's entire invasion. We're also seeing Ukraine conduct strikes deeper and deeper into Russian territory. A 1,000-mile strike is nothing to be sniffed at, especially when you consider the fact that this strike was carried out using drones. Ukraine didn't break any records when it attacked Metafrax. It actually did that just a few days before, when SBU drones scored direct hits on the Ukhta oil refinery in Russia's Komi Republic. But there wasn't much difference between that strike and the Metafrax one. In the case of the Ukhta refinery, Ukraine's drones traveled 1,750 kilometers, or about 1,087 miles. The Metafrax strike was less than 90 miles below that, and both show that Ukraine is getting increasingly comfortable striking at a very deep range inside Russian territory. That will worry Putin. Now, facilities that he thought were safe, facilities that he had hidden away deep in Russia, are finding themselves in Ukraine's crosshairs. And you have to assume that some of Russia's most valuable assets are being kept as far away from Ukraine as possible to keep them away from drones. That strategy is now up in the air. Even if Russia builds factories even deeper into its territory, that just means a logistical nightmare forms, leading to equipment taking even longer to reach the front lines. Again, this is systematic destruction, directly and indirectly. But on top of all of this, Ukraine is also building something with its deep strike campaign: leverage. Ahead of peace talks in Geneva, Russia has been trying to position Ukraine as a country that is on the verge of collapse. Ukraine's military is crumbling, it can't hurt the all-powerful Russia, and all the rest of that nonsense. Every time that Ukraine pulls off strikes like those we've seen in Perm and the Black Sea, it shatters the narrative that Putin is trying to create. As News Sky points out, these latest strikes send a signal that Ukraine doesn't view peace negotiations as a reason to reduce the pressure it's piling on Russia. Why should it? Russia isn't pausing its long-range attacks, and Ukraine wants to make it clear that its drones and missiles can reach targets deep into Russia, and will continue doing so for as long as Putin drags out his failed invasion. As Forbes points out, Ukraine's drone strikes have broadly weakened Russia's long-term warfighting capacity, and that's the whole point. Every time a drone touches down on a Russian target, it exposes the fact that Russia is far weaker than Putin claims. That is leverage. It's what Ukraine can use to get what it needs out of peace discussions because it allows Ukraine to sit at the table and say, "This will keep happening if you don't stop the war," to Putin's representatives. Whether Putin will stop or not is another question, as he has forced himself into a no-win situation. Putin can't quit. He'll look weak if he did. But he also can't keep the war that he started going forever. The numbers prove that, and they're absolutely brutal. Russia isn't going to recover for over a century after what Ukraine has done to it.
It was nestled 1,400 kilometers away from Ukraine, an untouchable super missile that Ukraine would never be able to find, and even if it did, it would never be able to hit. Putin was confident, overconfident, in fact. The untouchable weapon was indeed found, and once it was, Ukraine did what it does best: obliterate it. With the weapon erased, Putin has been left asking himself how Ukraine pulled off the attack when it was supposed to never have long-range capabilities in the first place. Something that Putin thought could never exist just hit Russia hard. Once again, Putin has been proven wrong. We head to the Voktinsk machine-building plant, located in Russia's Udmurt Republic, which has already been sanctioned by practically every major Western nation as well as a few others. The US, UK, Australia, Japan, Ukraine, and Switzerland all have this plant on their sanctions list, as does the European Union. And there's a very good reason why. The plant, which is 1,400 kilometers or about 870 miles away from Ukraine, is one of the most important cogs in Russia's missile-making machine. That's why it's located so far away from Ukraine and the rest of Europe. Putin has been trying to hide the plant away, hoping that sheer distance alone will be enough to protect it from being struck as hard by Ukraine's flying sanctions as it has been by the more traditional economic ones. On February 21st, a report by The Telegraph revealed that this supposedly untouchable plant had become the latest victim of a Ukrainian strike. The outlet reports that Ukraine's general staff has confirmed an attack on the Voktinsk machine-building plant using FP-5 Flamingo drone hybrid missiles. The attack, which appears to have devastated the facility, is a strike that Putin never thought would happen and certainly didn't see coming, as we'll explain a little later in the video. But as Ukraine's Flamingo drone missiles flew, the reality was brought home to Russia and the people who live near the untouchable plant. Footage from locals circulated on Russian Telegram channels showed windows shattered in nearby buildings and a huge fire raging, with smoke billowing from the territory of the plant, The Telegraph reports. The regional head of the Udmurt Republic, Alexander Brechalov, was even forced to confirm that Ukraine had struck, which is a rare break from Russia's usual approach of pretending that anything that Ukraine hits was actually just a casualty of drone debris caused by Russia's supposedly stellar air defenses. There was no denying what Ukraine's Flamingos managed to pull off, though. The Voktinsk plant is now in flames, and there are a couple of big reasons why Ukraine targeted this plant: how it's grown and what it makes. On the growth side of things, the Voktinsk plant has managed to expand even when weighed down by sanctions. As the Kyiv Independent reveals in its report on Ukraine's strike, the plant is state-owned and has grown massively since Putin launched his invasion. Thousands of new workers have been hired and new buildings have been constructed. Russia has also been able to import advanced machinery to the plant despite sanctions. An investigation conducted by the Kyiv Independent found that the likes of China, Belarus, and Taiwan have all sold supplies to the plant, which were funneled through third parties to evade sanctions, to enable Russia to carry out this expansion. For Ukraine, this was an example of sanctions either not being enforced or not being strong enough to stop Russia from doing what they want to do. So Ukraine took the situation into its own hands with a weapon that Putin thought would never exist. As for what the plant makes, there's a big reason why locals are reporting that Ukraine specifically targeted two of the plant's workshops. Two reasons, in fact, and they can be summed up in two words: Iskander-M and Oreshnik. The Voktinsk facility is one of Russia's most important, as it produces solid-fuel ballistic missiles. The Telegraph reports that the Iskander-M, which is a short-range ballistic missile system that Russia has used in many of its attacks against Ukraine, is made at the plant. It's also believed that Russia is building the nuclear-capable and hypersonic Oreshnik Mobile Intermediate-Range Ballistic Missile, or IRBM, that Putin claims is an unstoppable weapon that can travel at 10 times the speed of sound. Both of these missiles are massive threats to Ukraine. The Iskander-M is road mobile and has a range of up to 500 kilometers or about 310 miles, according to Missile Defense Advocacy. That means that Russia can launch the missile from inside its own territory or from deep in the rear of the occupied territories of Ukraine. The missile can carry both nuclear and conventional warheads, though Russia has of course only used the conventional so far in Ukraine. Even so, the 700 kilograms or about 1,540 pounds of firepower that can be packed into the Iskander-M is more than enough to do serious damage to whatever it strikes. We saw that on February 21st, which is when the New Voice of Ukraine reported on a Russian attack on Ukraine that included 120 drones and an Iskander-M missile. Though 106 of the 120 drones were neutralized, the Iskander-M struck. Ukraine needs to take this missile out of Russia's arsenal. Taking out the key production facility responsible for making it is the best way to do that. As for Oreshnik, that is even more dangerous than the Iskander-M, assuming you believe the Russian propaganda around the missile. Beyond the claims of the missile being hypersonic to the degree that it can hit Mach 10, it's also estimated to have a range of between 3,500 and 5,470 kilometers, or about 2,170 and almost 3,400 miles, according to Missile Threat. Like the Iskander-M, Oreshnik is road mobile, and even at the lower end of its estimated range would pose a massive threat not only to Ukraine, but also to practically all of Europe. Missile Threat says that Russia's hypersonic weapon can carry 6 MIRV warheads, with each being capable of deploying 6 submunitions for a total of 36 submunitions that could strike with every Oreshnik launch. Russia has used it against Ukraine before, albeit only a handful of times. The most recent of those times came in January, when they targeted the city of Lviv with an Oreshnik missile after having previously hit Dnipro. Isolated though these launches were, they served as a clear warning to Ukraine that it needed to hit what Putin thought was untouchable. By taking out Oreshnik, Ukraine eliminated one of the biggest threats that Russia has, and now that the Voktinsk factory is burning, it's clear that Ukraine is on a mission to take Oreshnik down at its source. The super missile has been taken down. And we're going to explain why Putin thought that would never happen in just a few minutes. But before we do, the destruction of workshops at Voktinsk isn't the only thing that Ukraine managed to achieve in its most recent aerial strikes against Russia. As the Telegraph reports, Ukraine also managed to strike the Neftogorsk gas processing plant, which is based in Russia's Samara region. On top of that, Ukraine also struck against Russian facilities in the occupied portion of Donetsk, scoring direct hits on a drone workshop and a lubricants warehouse. As has been the case with all of Ukraine's long-range strikes, what we see here is Ukraine's strategy of weakening the Russian war machine from the inside. Let's come back to the Voktinsk attack. When providing details about Ukraine's strike, Brechelov would only say that the missile manufacturing plant had been struck by drones. He didn't say what kind, and frankly, he has undersold what Ukraine pulled off in the Udmurt Republic. Ukraine's latest strike was made possible because the Flamingo drone missile hybrid has once again taken flight, and it's proven itself to be more than a match for the facilities that make some of the most terrifying missiles in Russia's arsenal. Capable of flying up to 3,000 kilometers or a little over 1,860 miles, and packing a 1,150 kilogram or around a 2,530 pound warhead, the Flamingo is a hybrid between drone and missile that is terrifying for Russia. It combines all of the best features of a cruise missile, especially when it comes to range and power, with those of a drone. And as the International Institute for Strategic Studies notes, the Flamingo reflects a wider trend of low-cost cruise missile designs emerging from OWA UAV deployment. Systems such as Ukraine's Ruta and Angeril's Barracuda have been developed by organizations with a background in UAV development rather than missile development. And that new form of development is what worries Putin most. In the mind of Russia's leader, a weapon like Flamingo was never supposed to exist, but it does. And before we dig deeper into that subject, this is just a quick side note to remind you that you are watching The Military Show. If you want more of this kind of insight, make sure that you subscribe to the channel. Now, the long-range problem that Russia thought it would never have. When Putin launched his invasion, Ukraine wasn't in much of a position to do much damage against Russia in terms of strikes on Russian territory. That's revealed by Fabian Hoffman of Missile Matters, who says that Ukraine's missile arsenal in 2022 was mostly made up of Soviet-era weapons that Russia understood and for which it had counters. Ukraine has started developing some missiles of its own, most notably the R-360 Neptune anti-ship missile. But that has only been delivered to Ukraine's Navy in 2021, and at least in Putin's mind, it wouldn't have made much of a difference anyway. Neptune might hit a ship in the Black Sea here and there, but it wasn't a missile that Ukraine could use to do damage to Russia on its own turf. Putin also believed that Ukraine would struggle to build on what it had, as Hoffman explains. Structural constraints in Ukraine's missile industry were significant, deep historical dependence on Russian components and markets, sharply disrupted after 2014 and only partially substituted by 2022, Hoffman says. For Putin, this essentially translated to Ukraine not having the infrastructure to build weapons that could strike Russia, even if it had some of the most brilliant technical minds from the former Soviet Union. Still, Russia took steps to destroy what there was of Ukraine's missile industry. The first year of Putin's invasion saw Russia carry out strikes against Ukraine's missile production plants, such as the Pivden-Marsh strike in Dnipro back in November 2022. Combine strikes like these with Putin's arrogant assumption that Ukraine wouldn't be able to build up its long-range capabilities before Russia overran the country, and you get a recipe for Putin believing that Oreshnik and its ilk were untouchable. Putin was so unconcerned about Ukraine's domestic long-range capabilities that he switched his focus to the West. Ukraine started receiving some weapons from Western partners such as Storm Shadow and Scalp missiles from the UK and France, along with ATACMS missiles from the US. Powerful though they are, these weapons can't strike too deeply into Russia. Storm Shadow has a range of about 250 kilometers or around 155 miles, with ATACMS offering a little more range at 300 kilometers or about 186 miles. Dangerous for sure, but more of a threat to the border regions of Russia and the ships in the Black Sea than anywhere else. All Putin would have to do is make sure that missile plants like Votkinsk were positioned out of range of Ukraine's Western weapons, and Russia would be fine to build whatever it wanted. We now know that Putin was wrong. Russia's leader made the mistake of underestimating Ukraine yet again, and he assumed that Russia's most valuable missile facilities were untouchable. As Putin lambasted the West for providing long-range missiles to Ukraine, he failed to do anything about Ukraine building its own long-range weapons. Arrogance came before the fall for Putin, as his focus on the West meant that Ukraine was able to build weapons like the Flamingo, along with the many long-range weapons that came before it, without Russia stopping it. Why would Russia even try? Putin believed that weapons like the one that just struck the Votkinsk facility would never exist. By the end of 2023, Ukraine had started showing hints that it intended to scale up domestic missile and long-range weapon production. The country's hand was somewhat forced as Ukraine realized that some of the Western weapons that it hoped to receive, such as the German-made Taurus, weren't coming. And even those that Ukraine was getting, especially the ATACMS, came with restrictions on where and how Ukraine could use them. In fact, it wasn't until November 2024 that the US gave Ukraine permission to strike limited locations on Russian territory with ATACMS. With all of these factors at play, Ukraine just kept on working. By the end of 2024, Hoffman reports, Ukraine was in a position where it could build its own long-range drones and some mini-cruise missiles. The signs were all there that more was coming, but Putin ignored them. He was still arrogant in his belief that no matter what Ukraine built, it wouldn't be able to hit Russia's most valuable assets. By August of 2025, Ukraine was fielding a host of long-range drones such as the Lyuchi and FP-1, and they were doing massive damage to Russian oil refineries and other targets. Still, Putin did nothing. Sure, there were now drones flying over Russian territory practically every week, but most only had small payloads. It wasn't like Ukraine had a missile-like weapon that could do tons of damage, but Ukraine was getting there, despite what Putin thought and claimed. By the end of 2025, the Flamingo was ready to go. In 2026, we've already seen Ukraine use it several times to take out key Russian targets, including another site related to Oreshnik that we'll reveal at the end of the video. Finally, with Flamingo taking flight, Putin woke up to the fact that Ukraine was producing weapons capable of hitting what he once believed were untouchable targets in Russia. Putin tried to stop it. According to the military analyst, Russia expended considerable resources to figure out where the Flamingo was being built, and once it did, Russia carried out a strike against the drone missiles production facilities. The outlet claims that Russia used Oreshnik for this attack. Regardless, it didn't work, as Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky reported in mid-February, production of Flamingo has continued despite the Russian strike. The Votkinsk missile production facility is just the latest victim of a weapon that Putin thought could never exist. There will be many more. As the Center for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA, notes, the flight of the Flamingo means serious trouble has come Russia's way. From the Russian standpoint, the future looks worrying. If and when such a missile capability is deployed, Ukraine's long-range strike campaign will increase in intensity, likely to the detriment of Russia's critical oil and gas infrastructure, which is already struggling under Ukraine's persistent attacks using existing capabilities, CEPA says. It appears that this is an underestimation of Ukraine's capabilities, which is a common theme in the story. Ukraine will be hitting oil and gas facilities, sure, but with the use of Flamingo against a facility that builds Iskander-M and Oreshnik missiles, we're seeing far more ambition in Ukraine's approach than Putin could have expected. Ukraine's work on its long-range arsenal has paid off. Now it can hit more targets inside Russia than ever before. So what does all of this mean for the future of the Ukraine war? For one, there's no denying that the timing of Ukraine's attack on the Vokhinsk plant was symbolic in terms of its timing. The news of the strike broke very soon after the latest rounds of peace talks between Russia and Ukraine broke down. Held in Geneva over the course of a couple of days, the talks ended on February 18th, again without any kind of breakthrough. Still, Russia demands that Ukraine cede territory. With its latest Flamingo attack, Ukraine has dispelled the Russian narrative that it's on the verge of defeat. If anything, Ukraine is in a position to weaken Russia more than it ever has before, and the ruining of Russia's ability to build some of its most important missiles is a perfect example of that. UATV adds an interesting point in its report on Ukraine's Flamingo strike. It says that Russia responded with yet another long-range attack on Ukraine. Only, as is often the case with Russia's strikes, the country targeted predominantly civilian rather than military targets. However, Putin may have slipped up this time around. In addition to its usual targets, Russia also apparently hit a production building owned by the American company Mondelez International. That could be a problem for Putin. The facility represents one of America's first major investments in Ukraine following the collapse of the Soviet Union, and if UATV is correct, Russia's strike against the facility was very deliberate. Perhaps Putin is panicking over Flamingo and Ukraine's growing long-range arsenal. If he is, then striking Western businesses in Ukraine is far from the sort of decision that will calm the panic down. How can Moscow talk about economic dialogue with the United States while attacking American production facilities? UATV asks. It's an interesting question, and it will be interesting to see how the US responds and what impact this strike will have on America's treatment of Russia in future peace talks. As for Ukraine, it's going to keep on pushing with its long-range strategy. The weapons that Putin never thought would exist are here, and Ukraine isn't going to stop there. Evolution of its aerial tactics is on Ukraine's agenda, meaning that Flamingo is a starting point rather than the end goal. Ukraine has also built other missiles and missile-like weapons such as Long Neptune and Palyantsia, which it's using to strike Russian territory. ATACMS and Storm Shadow are now in play, and Flamingo's production is ongoing. As the Vokhinsk factory burns, Putin will be asking just how many more of Russia's supposedly untouchable assets are now under threat. Russia's leader won't like the answer. It's a lot more than he ever imagined could be. And to prove that, you may remember that we told you that Ukraine had struck another Oreshnik-related facility earlier in the video. That attack came before Ukraine's strike on Russia's missile-making factory, and it was yet more proof that Ukraine has proven Putin wrong with its long-range strategy.
Around 600 miles away from Ukraine sits an unassuming Russian city named Cheboksary. That city is home to the VNIIR Progress plant, where workers toil away day and night to produce something President Vladimir Putin desperately needs: components for his drones, missiles, and glide bombs. Now that factory lies in ruins. A stealthy Ukrainian drone strike just hit home in Cheboksary and has taken out one of Russia's most important factories. Putin is furious. Ukraine's deep strike has just destroyed the brains of his Ukraine war machine. On June 9th, United 24 Media reported that Ukraine had carried out a precision drone strike on an electronics manufacturer that is vital to Putin's war effort. This strike was unlike most that Ukraine has carried out in the past. Rather than sending a horde of 100 drones or more to confuse Russia's air defense and guarantee a direct hit, Ukraine only sent 2 drones into the heart of Cheboksary. 2 was all Ukraine needed. Those drones managed to sneak past Russia's air defenses and touch down on the VNIIR Progress plant in Russia's Chuvash Republic. They had traveled almost 600 miles to get there, and when they hit home, they devastated a plant that is owned by ABS Electro and responsible for building components Putin needs to get several of his most important drones and missiles into the air. Worse yet for Russia's leader, the plant also builds the UMPK kits Russia uses to convert its Soviet-era dumb bombs into the devastating glide bombs Russia has used to pelt Ukraine's cities for almost 2 years. That plant is now in flames, and Russia can't hide away from what happened. It can't claim that drone debris was responsible. How do we know? There are images from the incident that prove Ukraine scored a direct hit, shared by the General Staff of Ukraine's Telegram page. The picture shows a raging fire and plumes of black smoke rising into the air over the Russian plant. More footage, this time shared by Militani, offers indisputable proof that it wasn't the debris Russia so often claims causes fires at its plant. The 12-second video shows in clear detail a Ukrainian drone hurtling through the sky before it touches down on the already flaming plant. We hear the drone, we see it fly from the top of the screen, and most importantly, we both see and hear the explosion that it causes when it strikes its target. There's no hiding away from this for Russia. Ukraine just took out the brains of its aerial operation. The Ukrainian General Staff confirmed the strike, along with sharing the picture of the aftermath, stating simply, The facility was confirmed hit by at least 2 unmanned aerial vehicles, followed by a large-scale fire. Andriy Kovalenko, who leads Ukraine's Center for Countering Disinformation, provided more confirmation. Something struck the Progress plant in Cheboksary, a facility directly involved in Russia's missile production cycle, including the Iskander system, Kovalenko wrote on Telegram. Progress Factory is responsible for producing guidance, stabilization, and flight control systems that are integrated into strike platforms during the assembly stage. The plant also manufactures Kometa-Trip modules, Russian satellite navigation units that support GLONASS GPS functionality and feature jamming protection, he added. Okay, so Ukraine has confirmed the attack, you might think, but what about Russia? As we said earlier, Russia couldn't hide away from this one. There's too much footage, and the fire burning in Cheboksary is too big to quell immediately. That forced the city's regional governor, Oleg Nikolaev, to also take to Telegram to confirm what Ukraine had already proven. The Progress plant had been taken out. 2 UAVs or unmanned aerial vehicles fell on the territory of the JSC VNIIR, in connection with which a responsible decision was made to suspend production to ensure the safety of employees temporarily, Nikolaev wrote. All of this brings us to some questions. What did Ukraine just destroy, and how did it manage to pull all this off? United 24 Media says that the VNIIR Progress plant specializes in the production of the Global Navigation Satellite System, or GNSS, receivers and antennas that Russia builds into any of its weapons that use GPS or GLONASS to navigate toward Ukraine. Those systems include many of Russia's missiles and drones, which we'll get into in a moment, along with the glide bombs that Putin has used to destroy Ukrainian infrastructure and devastate its cities throughout the war. But that's not all that this plant builds. It's also responsible for crafting electrical components used by Russia's Navy, United 24 says. These include circuit breakers, contactless modules, and relays used in several Russian vessels, such as the Yasen M-class nuclear-powered submarine. Ukraine won't be too concerned about taking any of those submarines out of action. Russia hasn't been able to leverage its Black Sea fleet fully for over a year, thanks to Ukraine's missile and drone strikes in and around Crimea. Still, holding up Putin's plans to build and maintain his submarines is a nice little bonus for a strike designed to take out a key component manufacturer. And there's more. On a wider scale, the VNIIR Progress plant also builds the software and hardware systems Russia uses for its shipbuilding, heavy, and energy industries. SCADA systems, which are control systems that allow for the monitoring of high-end industrial equipment, may have just gone up in flames, as an array of electronic modules and computer technology used in Russia's integrated microelectronics, says United 24. And that's not all Ukraine achieved on June 8th. Euromaidan press reports that Ukraine also launched drone strikes against facilities in the Voronezh, Nizhny Novgorod, and Tambov regions, which forced airport closures in Saratov, Kazan, and several other Russian cities. Those airport closures have become a key part of Ukraine's bigger picture strategy against Russia in 2025. Each closure brings the Ukraine war home for the Russian people, serving as a reminder that Putin's invasion is ongoing and can affect their daily lives. Novaya Gazeta says that Ukraine has managed to shut down 217 airfields between January 1st and May 7th, which is more than the combined 149 closures it forced in 2023 and 24. You can add at least 2 more airfield closures to that list thanks to Ukraine's June 8th attacks. All in all, the Ukrainian strike has delivered great results. A key electronic components plant now lies in flames, more Russian airports were forced to close, and Ukraine forced Russia to expend more of its air defense munition to repel drone attacks elsewhere. Here's how they did it. When we report on Ukraine's drone strikes, we usually tell you that Ukraine sends dozens, if not hundreds, of drones into Russian territory. That's a clear tactic here. By sending so many drones, Ukraine can confuse Russia's air defenses by forcing them to hit decoys, clearing the way for other drones to deliver their explosive payloads to their targets. That's not what happened on June 8th. Ukraine took a far stealthier approach by deploying just 2 of its long-range drones, which managed to sneak through Russia's air defenses to hit the Progress plant. Those drones were both AN-196 Lyuchi, unmanned aerial vehicles or UAVs, says United 24, and they're impressive pieces of military hardware. In November 2024, United 24 created a profile of these remarkable drones, dubbing them Ukraine's version of Russia's Shahids. They'd existed before November, but Ukraine had carried out a series of upgrades that may have been what made it possible for those drones to hit the Progress plant on June 8th. Among those upgrades, the outlet reported, was the ability to equip the AN-196 Lyuchi with a 165-pound warhead. That represented a 50% increase over the drone's previous 110-pound payload, with that extra explosive power clearly being demonstrated in Cheboksary on June 8th. United 24 provides other details about the drone, noting that it was introduced publicly in October 2022 by the defense manufacturer Ukroboronprom. The drone has a range of more than 621 miles, and it features a dual-boom low-wing fuselage and a pusher-propeller engine found at the drone's rear. The manufacturers make it using fiberglass reinforced with a metal mesh, which helps to keep its weight down and enables long-range attacks. There are also rumors that Ukroboronprom has managed to double the drone's range to over 1,200 miles, though those reports remain unconfirmed as of United 24's profile. It was the perfect drone for the job. Low profile, long range, and packing a powerful punch, the AN-196 Liuchi can destroy almost any unarmored target it strikes. Putin just learned that thanks to the Progress Plant attack. Now he's left without the vital electronic components he needs to continue his massive aerial assaults against Ukraine. And that brings us to what this strike really means for Russia. Russia just lost the ability to build several of its most vital weapon systems. Among them are several of the drones Putin relies on to pelt Ukraine's cities. United 24 says that Russia uses the components the Progress factory builds to manufacture its Lancet, Orlan 10, and the new variants of the Iranian-made Shahid drones that Russia is building domestically. Those drones, along with the many others that Russia is building, have had devastating effects on Ukraine throughout Putin's invasion. If you need an example, we need only head back to June 6th. On that date, Russia launched a massive air attack mere days after Ukraine managed to take out around 40 of Russia's prized bomber aircraft during its Operation Spiderweb attack. You can learn more about how Ukraine pulled off this brilliant strike, which involved sneaking over 100 quadcopter drones across the Russian border, in our video offering an in-depth analysis of the attack. Russia's response, according to CNN, was to launch a barrage of drones and missiles across huge swathes of Ukraine, with the raid killing at least 6 people and injuring dozens more. According to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, Russia used around 400 drones and 40 missiles in the attack, making it one of the largest single-day strikes Russia has used since Putin started his supposed special military operation. The message here is simple. Putin uses his drones to hurt Ukraine, and his attacks have been intensifying. Another CNN report, this time published on June 9th, dug deeper into how Russia has been using drones against Ukraine. It says that Russia's near-daily drone strikes on Ukraine have been growing more intense in 2025. Where Putin once launched dozens of drones in a single strike, he's now launching hundreds. We can see that both before and after Operation Spiderweb. Putin's response to that attack was to send around 480 drones into Ukraine. The day before Ukraine pulled the trigger on its bombing-destroying mission, Russia had hit Ukraine with a force of around 470 drones. The attack showcases a massive difference in the Russian and Ukrainian approaches to using drones, says leading Russia analyst Mark Galeotti. Speaking to CNN, he says, "From a political perspective, it's the Ukrainians who demonstrate that they are the nimble, imaginative, effective ones, and the Russians are just thuggish brutes who continue to grind along." In other words, while Ukraine is carrying out carefully planned attacks using its drones, Putin's only strategy is the same one he's used in the ground aspect of the Ukraine war: hope that sheer numbers will win the day. And therein lies the reason why Ukraine's attack on the Progress Plant is such a massive win. Ukraine was never going to be able to stop Russia from building the shells and airframes it needs for its drones. No Ukrainian attack would devastate Russia's ammunition stockpiles to the point where Putin couldn't pack those drones with explosives. But an attack on the plant that builds the components those drones need to take to the skies in the first place, that's a far more viable option. With the Progress Plant now in flames, Russia has scores of drone airframes that won't be able to fly to Ukraine, at least for as long as it takes Russia to repair the damage done to the plant. Then there are the missiles. While Russia's drone attacks against Ukraine capture headlines due to the sheer numbers that Putin sends, it's often Russia's missiles that do the most damage to Ukraine's cities and infrastructure. We know that the Progress Plant strike has taken out a facility that builds the components used in the guidance systems for 3 of Russia's most important missiles: the Iskander, the Kh-101, and the Kh-69. All 3 are devastating in their own ways. Missile Threat says that the Iskander is a short-range ballistic missile that has a range of 310 miles. That may not sound like much, but it's more than enough for Russia to launch this missile from behind the front lines into Ukraine's cities. Iskanders were used in the retaliatory strike to Operation Spiderweb, CNN reports, touching down in Kyiv and the Ukrainian city of Chernihiv, which sits close to Ukraine's border with Belarus. Iskander missiles can deliver a payload weighing up to 1,543 pounds, with Russia having plenty of options when it comes to what that payload is. On the conventional side, it can load the Iskander with earth penetrator, high explosive, and submunition warheads. However, far more worrying for Ukraine is Russia's ability to pack thermobaric warheads, also known as vacuum bombs, into the Iskander. The missile has been in operation since 2006, and Putin has used it constantly during the Ukraine war. Still, we can't ignore the impact that the Kh-101 and Kh-69 have had on Ukraine. The former is an air-launched cruise missile that has a nuclear variant, the Kh-102. It's designed to be a stealth missile capable of avoiding Ukraine's air defense systems, and it can carry a payload weighing up to 900 pounds. As with the Iskander, Russia has options when it comes to that payload: High-explosive, submunition, and fragmentation warheads are all available for the KH-101, and if Putin decides to go down the nuclear route, he can pack the KH-102 variant with a 250-kiloton warhead that would devastate Ukraine. Add all of this to the missile's range, which is estimated to stretch up to 1,739 miles according to Missile Threat, and you get a cruise missile that can be launched from so far behind the front lines that Ukraine has little chance of reaching it. Instead of taking out the KH-101 directly, it's just taking out a factory that builds the components used in that terrifying cruise missile. The same applies to the KH-69. Army recognition calls this a subsonic cruise missile that can reach speeds approaching 621 miles per hour. It can't travel as far or pack as much of a punch as the KH-101. The KH-69 is loaded with a 683-pound warhead, which comes in penetrator and high-explosive varieties, and its range is similar to the Iskander's at 248 miles. Still, it's another powerful weapon in Putin's arsenal, and one that he's launched regularly using the aircraft he has stationed behind the front lines of the war. And when we say regularly, we mean it. Putin's missiles have rained down on Ukraine constantly during the Russian leader's invasion. In February, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, revealed just how important both missiles and drones have been to Putin's strategy since he first attacked Ukraine. It points out that Russia achieved an average rate of 24.3 missiles and drones launched at Ukraine per day between September 28, 2022 and October 6, 2024. Russia has used a diverse array of missiles with more than 25 unique models. The three Ukraine just nullified with its Progress Plant attack are among the most commonly used. The KH-101, along with Russia's drones and its X-555 air-launched cruise missile, account for 75% of all missiles Russia has launched. Ukraine does a pretty good job of intercepting these missiles and drones. CSIS says that its overall interception rate is 84.1%, meaning most of what Putin sends into Ukraine gets shot out of the skies. However, most isn't all. Given the 24.3 average, that still means that an average of 3.8 of Russia's missiles and drones break through Ukraine's air defenses every day to hit cities, energy infrastructure, and other key military targets. Putin has been achieving success through sheer numbers alone. The thuggish tactics Mark Galeotti spoke about with CNN have worked for Russia so far, as we can see from the sheer numbers of daily missile and drone attacks against Ukraine. With the Progress Plant strike, Ukraine may have just found a way to force Putin into reducing the intensity of his missile attacks. After all, a missile, no matter how powerful it is, won't be of much use to Putin if he doesn't have the components needed for that missile's guidance system to ensure it can hit its target. Finally, there are the glide bombs. If ever there was a perfect example of Russia's thuggish approach to the Ukraine war, it would be glide bombs, made using Soviet-era dumb bombs. These glide bombs can weigh anywhere between 1,100 and 6,600 pounds, and they're launched at Ukraine from behind the front lines. The bombs work thanks to a special wing kit attached to the explosive, which the BBC says can cost Russia as little as $20,000 to make. That kit features pop-out wings that allow a dumb bomb to glide toward its intended target. The glide bomb doesn't have to score a direct hit. Its sheer size and power are enough, especially when Russia is launching them in huge quantities at Ukraine's cities. How huge? In the BBC's May 2024 report on Russia's glide bombs, it noted that Zelensky claimed that 3,000 of them were launched at Ukraine in March 2024 alone. Reuters' explanation of what glide bombs are revealed that the intensity of these strikes hadn't relented later in the year. During 1 week in the middle of September 2024, Putin's forces dropped 900 glide bombs on Ukraine. They're devastating weapons, and Russia can keep launching them for as long as it's capable of making the dumb bombs it needs to convert into glide bombs. That's the last reason why the Progress Plant strike was so important. Earlier we told you that the plant also builds the UPMK kits Russia is using to convert its dumb bombs into glide bombs. Guess what happens now those kits aren't being made anymore? Russia can't launch glide bombs from behind the front lines. If nothing else, the Progress Plant strike showcases what Mark Galeotti highlighted when speaking to CNN. Ukraine uses its drones intelligently to maximize the damage it causes to Putin's war machine. That's just what it did on June 8th. The brains of Putin's aerial offensive have been shut down, leaving scores of Russia's missiles, drones, and glide bombs grounded. The reprieve from Putin's pressure tactics may only be temporary. Russia will already be working hard to get the Progress Plant up and running again. But that may be enough for Ukraine as it fights to prevent Putin from taking over more of its territory during the summer. What happened in Cheboksary is just one of many examples of the intelligent approach Ukraine has been taking against Russia in 2025.
It's easy to forget that every weapon Russia uses in Ukraine is built from many parts. An artillery shell, for instance, requires material for the casing and explosive chemicals that ensure the shell doesn't end up a metal dud once it lands.
Take away just one part and the weapon cannot be built. That's precisely what Ukraine did over the weekend. Ukraine has struck 1,800 kilometers, or about 1,118 miles deep into Russia to take out a chemical plant that is vital to Russia's ammunition production. Vladimir Putin's inner core burns as Ukraine scores yet another deep strike victory in what is becoming a war of 1,000 cuts. On September 14th, the Kyiv Independent was among several outlets that reported on a Ukrainian long-range drone strike conducted the day before. That strike saw Ukraine send its drones almost as deep as they've ever gone into Russian territory, as they traveled over 1,000 miles before touching down in the Perm Krai region. Why that region? Well, it's home to the Metafrax chemical plant, which produces several chemicals that are used in the manufacture of Russia's artillery and mines. The attack took place at about 9:20 p.m. local time, the Kyiv Independent reports, and it saw Ukraine strike an industrial enterprise in the city of Gubaka that is now known to be the chemical plant in question. Beyond that, we don't know many other details. Interfax says that one of its sources in the main intelligence directorate of Ukraine's Ministry of Defense has confirmed that the strike took place. Specifically, the attack was conducted by the Unmanned Systems Forces of the Department of Active Operations, which is part of Ukraine's Ministry of Defense and is responsible for many of Ukraine's most important deep strikes. The source also confirmed that the Metafrax plant was targeted because of its chemical production, with its manufacture of explosives that included urea, methanol, and pentrite being what Ukraine wanted to cut off. There is also a video. However, the footage doesn't show the strike directly. Published by Euromaidan Press to its X profile, the footage appears to have been shot by a passenger in a car driving by the Metafrax chemical plant. The 42 seconds of video, which Euromaidan says was first published by Astra, shows smoke streaming into the air from the plant, though a large building prevents anybody from seeing the origin of the smoke. But the picture becomes clearer at about the 20-second mark. At that point, the amateur videographer zooms in on that very building to show that metal sheeting is hanging off the sides and there's a massive scorch mark above the damage. That doesn't happen by chance. Whatever the building is, it's absorbed a direct hit from something that's caused a lot of damage. Still, none of this is official confirmation, and outside of Interfax's source, there has been no official word from Ukraine on the strike, at least not yet. The Kyiv Independent also says that it hasn't been able to independently confirm that the strike hit the specific chemical plant that Ukraine was targeting, though the short video suggests that it will only be a matter of time before that confirmation comes. One thing we do know is that the Gubaka regional governor has at least confirmed that Ukraine attacked the region on September 13th. In a typically Russian response, Dmitry Makonin took to Telegram to attempt to downplay the strike while also encouraging residents of the region to stay calm and not panic. An enemy drone has just flown into one of the industrial enterprises of Gubaka, Makonin stated. This is interesting because it appears the regional governor is confirming that the drone penetrated Russia's air defenses, though he, of course, says nothing about what the drone struck or whether it struck anything at all. There are no casualties. The enterprise is operating normally. Emergency services are working on the site. There is no threat to the safety of residents. We ask you to remain calm and trust only official sources of information. The situation is under control, Makonin added. All of this seems pretty standard so far. However, Makonin's plea that anybody reading this statement listen only to official sources of information hints that Russia is attempting to control the narrative around this strike. And Makonin makes that abundantly clear with the final part of his Telegram statement. I appeal to all residents of the region. Refrain from publishing photos and videos of the UAV. By posting such information on social networks, you are helping the enemy, who has made yet another pathetic attempt to intimidate us. They will not succeed. Victory will be ours, Makonin concludes. The final chest pumping may be meant to inspire, but it's the part about not sharing videos to social media that Russia really wants to instill into its citizens. Videos of the plant would allow the world to see that Ukraine succeeded. Russia doesn't want that sort of information getting out. Narratives are much tougher to control when there is video evidence contradicting the official Russian line. The Kremlin is so keen to keep videos offline that it's even cleared the way for individual regions to start fining residents who post footage of drone strikes online. That's according to Medusa, which reported in June that the Kremlin officially considered a countrywide ban on publishing drone strike footage before it backed down in an effort to maintain a balance between information security and freedom. Translation, making the sharing of footage illegal would make Russia look even worse in the eyes of its enemies. Now, Medusa says, punishment is being adopted at the region-wide level, with 12 of Russia's regions now having fines in place. At the time of writing, only the regions of Tula and Kaluga have enforced their fines, with the latter having brought 42 misdemeanor cases to court over drone footage. Individuals caught sharing footage may have to pay up to 4,000 rubles, which is roughly equivalent to $48, though organizations that share footage have to pay a heftier fine of about $1,200. We don't know if such laws are in place in Perm Krai. However, the lack of footage, barring a single video showing that the Metafrax facility has clearly been damaged, suggests that Makonin's warnings are being heeded. Whether that's because the region's people want to support Russia or they don't want to be fined is up to the viewer. Still, it's pretty clear that a strike took place. McConan has all but confirmed it, even if he won't offer any details. We have a video of the Metafrax facility smoldering and with clear damage to one of its buildings that looks like it was caused by a drone. And if Interfax is to be believed, sources inside Ukraine's Ministry of Defense are saying that the strike happened. The evidence seems pretty clear. Metafrax is burning. But why did Ukraine choose this facility for its latest long-range strike? The factory's status may have played a role in the decision. As Euromaidan Press highlights in its report on Ukraine's attack, Metafrax is one of Russia's largest private companies, having landed the 200th spot on a Forbes list of Russia's largest companies back in 2021. The Kyiv Independent adds that 2023 saw Metafrax Chemicals launch a new ammonia-urea melamine production facility at the Gubacka plant, which was responsible for producing 300,000 tons of ammonia during its first 8 months of operations. Plus, Metafrax Chemicals, which runs the facility, is important enough to Russia's war effort that it has been sanctioned by both the UK and Ukraine. So this plant was a scalp, a big one. Ukraine managed to hit it, even if the damage done isn't severe. It is enough to show that it's capable of claiming this scalp. Don't ignore the fact that the plant is also nearly 1,200 miles away from the border that Ukraine shares with Russia. Putin and his cronies would have never expected a Ukrainian drone to be able to penetrate that deeply into Russia's territory even a year ago. But Ukraine just pulled it off. And by doing that, Ukraine has shown Russia that none of its production facilities are safe, no matter how deep inside Russia they might be. That's an important message to send. But beyond the symbolic aspects of the strike, Ukraine is clearly trying to disrupt the flow of chemicals the plant produces, several of which have military applications. Take urea as an example. Urea on its own isn't necessarily a dangerous chemical. It's a fertilizer that's used in agriculture. However, when that fertilizer is mixed with nitric acid, it produces urea nitrate, which is a high explosive that has achieved some degree of infamy for its use in improvised explosive devices or IEDs, collective awareness to UXO reports. IEDs used in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan have all been found to contain this chemical compound, with urea nitrate also being a favorite among terrorists who need to make bombs out of immediately available chemicals. Because of its insensitivity and explosive stability, urea nitrate is predominantly used as the main charge in large IEDs, the outlet says. And Russia may have picked up on that potential. It doesn't use urea in the same way others do, meaning no urea nitrate. However, it does use the chemical to produce ammonia, which we mentioned earlier. According to Euromaidan Press, Russia uses ammonia to create ammonium nitrate, again using nitric acid, with the resulting compound being usable in artillery shells and mines. Do you remember our mention of how a weapon becomes useless when the parts needed to make it disappear? That's what Ukraine was shooting for with this strike. Taking out a plant that produces urea means cutting off Russia's supply of a chemical it needs to make mines and artillery shells. The fewer of both of these explosive munitions inside Ukraine, the more able Ukraine is to defend itself against Russia's assaults. Russia's military becomes weaker because it's not getting what it needs to hurt Ukraine. As is so often the case with Ukraine's deep strike strategy, Ukraine has inflicted another small wound on Russia's war machine that, when added to all of the other wounds caused by its deep strikes, is part of a death by 1,000 cuts approach, designed to take out the manufacturing needed to keep Putin's war going. Interestingly, Metafrax may seem like a strange target on the surface. Yes, the company creates chemicals and chemical compounds that have military uses, which is likely why it's been sanctioned by Ukraine and the UK. However, as Euromaidan Press notes, Metafrax has gone to great pains to avoid revealing any public ties to the Russian Defense Ministry, likely in an attempt to maintain a facade of corporate neutrality. We say facade because Euromaidan Press also points out that Metafrax has a parent company named Roshchem. Roshchem is directly tied to Russia's military, or perhaps more accurately, it has direct ties to Vladimir Putin. The Moscow Times revealed those ties back in April, when it reported on Roshchem's owners, Boris and Arkady Rottenberg. It would be easy to assume that these brothers are just two among the many oligarchs who make their millions thanks to Putin's warped policies and corrupt way of running his government. However, the Rottenbergs' ties with Putin stretch back further than most, with the Moscow Times revealing that the brothers are childhood friends of Russia's leader. The brothers have been busy during the Ukraine war. They have both architected and positioned themselves as the main beneficiaries of several Russian wartime asset seizures, the Moscow Times says, and they've placed their focus on acquiring as many chemical companies as they can over the past couple of years. What the brothers are doing is pretty big business. The Russian Prosecutor General's office has opened cases against more than 85 Russian businesses and returned 2.4 trillion rubles to the state since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the Moscow Times says, citing a report by the Financial Times. The Rottenbergs have made a very pretty penny from being so close to Putin as these asset seizures take place. Now, would you like to guess which former Forbes-listed country landed in Rottenberg's lap about a year ago? Metafrax, of course. In October 2024, Interfax reported that Roshchem won an auction announced by Russia's Federal Property Management Agency. that granted the company a nearly 97% stake in Metafrax. That company had been transferred to state ownership in 2023, Interfax says, meaning the facility that Ukraine struck is a perfect example of the corrupt relationship between Putin and his childhood friends that has blossomed since Russia launched its invasion. The brothers get to swallow up more Russian industry, perhaps knowing that they'll make a mint both during the war and long after. As for Putin, his federal government earned about $175 million from the sale. Oh, and Roskilde was the only participant in the auction that led to Metafrax being sold off. The corruption couldn't be clearer, and it shows us that Metafrax isn't the company that it was when Forbes was listing it as one of Russia's largest private enterprises. The company is technically still private, insofar as a company now owned by two of Putin's bosom buddies can be private. But the reality is that Metafrax is a tool of the Russian government today, regardless of its lack of outward claims of being part of Russia's defense industry. All of this information sheds new light on why Ukraine targeted Metafrax. Yes, the company already represented a major scalp thanks to its past reputation. Plus, the chemicals it produces are chemicals that Ukraine absolutely wants Russia to have less of, as we'll explain in more detail in a moment. However, the strike was personal. All of the information about the Rotenberg brothers, Putin, and the shady deals going on is publicly available, meaning it's almost guaranteed that Ukraine knows precisely who really operates the Metafrax plant. This was another message to Putin from Ukraine. We can't just strike deeper into Russia than you ever thought possible. We can strike at your core by hitting the businesses that you're essentially gifting to your friends in return for a few backhanders. While the Metafrax strike grabbed all of the headlines on September 13th, it wasn't the only target that Ukraine hit. Euromaidan Press says that Ukraine's main intelligence directorate and special operations forces combined to strike several railway lines in Russia between September 13th and 14th. Those lines are in the Oryol Oblast and Leningrad Oblast, with a Ukrainian source stating, "These railway branches are critically important logistical links in supplying occupying forces in the Kharkiv and Sumy directions." The Oryol strike killed a trio of Russian National Guard members as they were conducting a track inspection, Euromaidan Press says. As for the Leningrad strike, that derailed a locomotive that had 15 cisterns attached to it. While Russia has already claimed that all of these cisterns were empty, Ukraine says they were full of fuel intended for the front lines. Another train derailment in Leningrad is also believed to have killed a train engineer. On September 12th, the day before the Metafrax strike, Ukraine struck an oil refinery in Russia's Bashkortostan Republic, which is about 930 miles away from the border between Ukraine and Russia. That strike shows us that Ukraine is intent on continuing its flurry of refinery strikes from August, which have knocked out about 20% of Russia's oil refining capacity and caused fuel shortages throughout the country. Ukraine was busy over the weekend. When we say Putin was struck to his core, we mean it. His friends are dealing with damage to their chemical plant, which they only have because Putin made it possible for them to buy it with asset seizures. 2 Russian trains have been derailed, one of which may have been carrying fuel to the front lines, and one of the facilities responsible for producing that fuel may have just been taken offline by a Ukrainian drone. Now let's come back to the point we made earlier about Ukraine depriving Russia of much-needed chemicals with this Metafrax strike. On the artillery front, Russia cannot afford to lose a plant that plays such a vital role in helping the country to produce more artillery shells. Artillery has been one of Russia's main weapons since it launched its full-scale invasion, allowing it to bombard Ukraine's fortifications constantly, weakening them to the point where Russia's forces can advance. Only those bombardments have been getting weaker in 2025. Back in January, Newsweek reported that Ukraine's long-range strikes have managed to cut Russia's stockpiles of artillery ammunition in half. Less than a month later, it had become clear why that mattered, as Espresso.tv noted on comments made by the Commander-in-Chief of Ukraine's armed forces, Oleksandr Syrsky. A year ago, Russian forces had approximately a 10-to-1 advantage in artillery munitions. Today, this ratio has shrunk to nearly 2-to-1, Syrsky said in a Facebook post on February 8th. Syrsky also noted that Ukraine destroyed over 13,000 Russian artillery systems during the past year, in addition to its deep strikes taking out artillery shell stockpiles. Russia is now so desperate to get its hands on artillery shells that it's turned to North Korea to supply them, Forbes says. Of course, that comes with the problem of Putin placing Russia deeper into North Korea's pocket. North Korea is doing Russia a favor. Eventually, it's going to come calling for Russia to repay that favor. And now that Metafrax has been hit, Russia might have to rely on North Korea even more than it already is. It all adds up to fewer artillery shells for Russia. Plus, if Euromaidan Press is accurate and the chemicals being produced at Metafrax are also used to make mines, Ukraine just scored another victory for its soldiers. Ukraine feels like it's more landmine than land at this stage of the war. The Center for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA, reported in November 2024 that an estimated 2 million mines have been scattered in Ukraine, contaminating about 40% of the country's territory. Of course, some of these mines are mines Ukraine has scattered itself to defend against Russian advances. However, Russia is happily using mines, especially in cities where it's been forced to withdraw and wants to make it impossible for Ukraine's people to fully reclaim their land. These mines represent not merely a tactical weapon, but a long-term threat to civilian safety, agricultural recovery, and national reconstruction, SIPA says. It would be foolish to act as though the Metafrax strike will stop Russia from planting mines, but every little helps. Taking away the chemicals deprives Russia of at least some of its mines, and that can only be a good thing for Ukraine's defenders. Among the many victories Ukraine achieved with this single strike, that may end up being the most important, especially if Ukraine follows up with more attacks on Metafrax. The strike against the chemical plant offers yet another example of Russia's defenses outright failing. On September 13th, Ukraine once again showed that Russia has no response to its drones. Deep in Stavropol Krai is a radio plant. That plant is far from innocent. It produces some of the key tools Russia's army uses in its electronic warfare campaign, including equipment that's capable of jamming Ukraine's weapons. Right now, that plant is on fire. It's the latest victim of a long-range Ukrainian drone strike. Ukraine's deep strike has fried the nerve center of Russia's war machine, crippling Vladimir Putin's electronic warfare hub to limit the effectiveness of his electronic warfare campaign. Overnight on July 26th, Ukraine's security service, the SBU, launched a devastating drone strike against one of Russia's most important electronic warfare facilities. The Signal radio plant, which is nestled in Stavropol Krai, about 311 miles away from the nearest Ukraine-controlled territory, was bombarded with a drone strike designed to take out equipment used in Russia's frontline aircraft and by its troops inside Ukraine. The Kyiv Independent provides the basic details. It says the SBU has confirmed the strike, which amounted to a 1-2 punch that has devastated Russia's electronic warfare capabilities. The first attack targeted a building that Russia used to store expensive imported equipment such as computer numerical control machines, the outlet says. This equipment may have also included the dual-use components that China has been selling to Russia. Since Putin launched his full-scale invasion, China has served a crafty double role in the war. On one hand, it calls for peace between the two countries, attempting to portray a country that is concerned about the global impact of the war Putin started. On the other hand, it happily profits from selling dual-use components, which are components that can serve uses for both commercial and military purposes to Russia. On May 20th, Al Jazeera reported that the head of Ukraine's foreign intelligence service, Oleh Ivashenko, claims that his team has confirmed that China is providing these components, alongside other materials and equipment, to 20 Russian factories. There is information that China supplies tooling machines, special chemical products, gunpowder, and components specifically to defense manufacturing industries, he said. We have confirmed data on 20 Russian factories. Was the Signal plant among the 20? We don't know for sure. However, we do know that Ukraine targeted a storage facility holding imported parts, indicating that it was either receiving deliveries directly or sourcing them from other factories in Russia that are working in conjunction with China. As for Ukraine's second strike, it targeted a different building that the Kyiv Independent claims played host to an electronic devices workshop. In other words, Ukraine wasn't happy with just taking out the components Russia uses to build its electronic warfare equipment. It has also made it impossible for the staff at the Signal radio plant to assemble those components. It's a 2-for-1 strike. And it's left Russia's nerve center devastated. An unnamed source inside the SBU told the Kyiv Independent precisely what Ukraine hoped to achieve with the July 26th attack. The SBU continues to systematically disable enemy facilities working for the war against Ukraine. Each such attack stops production processes and reduces the enemy's military potential, the source claimed. And if there was any doubt about just how successful Ukraine's strike was, those doubts have been dispelled by the footage that has emerged from the strike zone. The Astra Telegram channel has also reported on Ukraine's attack, noting that the strike caused several small fires that Russia claims have been extinguished. It also provided a pair of videos, both shot by local residents on the ground. The first is the most damning in terms of any Russian attempts to deny that the attack took place. The footage shows a Ukrainian drone on a fast descent toward a Signal radio plant building. The video only lasts for a couple of seconds as the drone soon strikes its target, exploding in a fireball against the side of a building so powerfully that it causes the person filming the drone to scream. A second video showcases one of Ukraine's drone strikes from a greater distance. A drone is seen streaking across the Russian skies, with no sound of air defense going off in the background. That tells us one of two things. Either Ukraine's drones managed to circumvent whatever air defenses Russia had built up around its vital nerve center, or those defenses either aren't there or failed to fire on the drones. Either way, Putin will be humiliated, as the footage shows Ukraine's drone traveling toward its target unimpeded before it descends and, like the first drone, explodes into a massive fireball as it hits its target. Russia simply can't deny that the strike took place in the face of such overwhelming evidence. United 24 Media provides its own report on the strike, stating that it took place at about 5 a.m. local time. Loud explosions and a brief fire were caused at the signal plant, the outlet says, and Stavropol Krai Governor Vladimir Vladimirov has been forced to confirm that the attack took place. As is so often the case with Russia, there is no confirmation about the scale of the damage the Ukrainian attack caused. Russia doesn't want to reveal that. All Vladimirov said was that there were no casualties, his city's civilian infrastructure was unaffected, and that the fire caused by the attack was promptly extinguished, says United 24. All three claims may be true, but that only goes to show how precise Ukraine's long-range drone strikes have become. It was able to pull off a 1-2 combo against one of Russia's key electronic warfare plants without causing any loss to civilian life or infrastructure. Compare that to Russia's devastating aerial strikes against Ukraine, which have killed 6,754 civilians during the first half of 2025 alone, according to the United Nations in Ukraine. And you have a clear contrast in approaches. Putin targets innocent people. Ukraine attacks the military facilities responsible for building weapons that fuel Russia's war machine. As for the facility that Ukraine struck, United 24 provides some important details. It says that the signal plant was built way back in 1971. It appears to have operated independently for about 4 decades before Putin decided to integrate the factory into the Russian state-owned defense company Rostec in 2012. Since then, the plant has specialized in the production of electronic warfare systems that are used in the Russian military's aircraft, as well as its ground and naval platforms. So it's a vital plant, and both Ukraine and the collective West know it. United 24 says that the plant was among the first that the US, Ukraine, the European Union, and Japan sanctioned back in 2022, when Putin launched his invasion. Those sanctions were supposed to stop Russia from receiving the components it uses to build its electronic warfare equipment. But as we mentioned earlier, China was more than happy to step up and fill the gap caused by the sanctions. As United 24 Media points out, the plant has continued operations, reportedly sourcing components through alternative supply chains, including Chinese-manufactured parts. Sanctions didn't do the job of taking out Russia's nerve center. Ukraine decided that a strike was the better solution. Thanks to United 24, we also know what kind of weapons the signal plant is responsible for producing. The outlet names 3, the Topol-E, Smalta, and Gardania systems. All 3 are vital cogs in the electronic warfare machine Putin has created for use in Ukraine. Starting with the Topol-E, Armed Conflict says this is a ground jamming station that is mounted to a vehicle, making it mobile. It's designed to jam several radar signals including ANAPS-125, ANAPS-138, and ANAPS-139. These are the signals used by the E-2C Hawkeye aircraft, meaning Russia was likely using the weapon to jam signals being provided to Ukraine's drones on the battlefield. The Topol-E works by using noise cancellation technology to jam its targets, the station being capable of working independently or as part of a larger network of electronic warfare equipment. The Topol-E comes in 2 versions. The fully mobile version is mounted to a vehicle and can be transported as needed, as we mentioned earlier. Armed Conflict says that there's also a semi-stationary version that Russia can use to create semi-permanent installations in key conflict zones. It's a smart machine too. The Topol-E can automatically search for and recognize the signals we mentioned earlier. Once it locates a signal, the machine tracks whatever aircraft is receiving those signals and displays the parameters of those signals to its 3 operators. It also automatically chooses the most appropriate jamming methods for those signals, meaning Russia's soldiers really only need to deploy the Topol-E and let it get to work. The system has a maximum interference range of 155 miles, though it's most effective at a range of between 37 and 49 miles, and it takes just 30 minutes to deploy, after which it can operate continuously for at least 24 hours. And now Russia's signal plant won't be able to build any more of them, at least temporarily. Then there's the Smalta. Unlike the Topol-E, the Smalta is an aerial electronic warfare platform that Russia typically installs into its Mi-8 SMV helicopters, according to Key Aero. The first version of the system was developed all the way back in the 1970s by the Kaluga Research Institute of Radio Engineering. Remember that the signal plant has been operating since 1971. The odds are that it's been building Smalta systems for as long as it's been open. That original Smalta system, known as the Smalta V, was initially designed to counter the guidance systems used by America's MIM-23 Hawk low to medium altitude surface-to-air missile systems. Immediately, that makes it clear why Russia wants to build more Smaltas. Hawk missiles have emerged as one of the best defenses that Ukraine has for countering the hordes of drones that Putin has been launching into the country. The missiles are so effective that the US and Greece have just announced the new multi-million-dollar package to refurbish Ukraine's Hawk systems. You can learn more about that package and what makes that missile so effective in our video. Russia wasn't happy with tackling Hawk missiles alone. It iterated on the original Smalta V to produce the Smalta PG, which entered service in 2000. That upgraded system boasts a far wider range of capabilities than its older cousin, as it's now capable of disrupting guidance systems in air, ground, and ship platforms. The Smolta PG operates on the X-band and can disrupt any radars that work in the 10 GHz frequency. Key Aero reports. It's capable of creating jamming signals across 10 different frequency channels and can operate in 7 directions simultaneously, making it a massive threat to any of Ukraine's missiles and drones. An upgraded version of the Smolta PG is also able to jam GPS and Russian GLONASS satellite navigation systems, the former of which we know for sure is used by many of the Western-made missiles and weapon systems Ukraine deploys against Russia. Just as with the Topol-E, Russia will be stung by the loss of a facility that produces such a vital component of Putin's electronic warfare campaign. Fewer Smolta systems in Ukraine equate to more successful Ukrainian drone and missile strikes against Russian targets. Finally, there's the Gardania. We don't know as much about this modern system as we do the Topol-E or the Smolta. Russia has been keeping its true capabilities under wraps as much as it can. What we do know comes from a February 2025 report published by VPK News, which says that the Gardania is a dual container active jamming station that Russia has created to protect its aircraft from both air-to-air and ground-to-air guided weapons. Marketing materials for the defensive weapon were provided at the Aero India 2025 exhibition, VPK says, which it quotes as claiming, "The Gardania dual container active jamming station was created for individually mutual, as well as group protection of aircraft by interfering with onboard and ground-based radars, as well as radar stations." That doesn't tell us all too much. However, we do know that the Gardania is carried directly by the aircraft that Russia deploys and is mounted on 2 suspension points. From the deployed aircraft, the Gardania then generates signals to interfere with the radars of almost any aircraft Ukraine has in its arsenal. VPK reports that Russia claims that the system is capable of adapting to even the most modern aircraft, and that a miniature version of the Gardania is already being deployed on Russian MiG-29 and MiG-35 aircraft. From its mounts, the Gardania can interfere with the guidance system of anti-aircraft missiles and artillery systems, as well as air-to-air missiles fired at it by an aerial combatant. In other words, Russia has created Gardania to keep its aerial platforms safe whenever they're operating in or around Ukraine. No more Gardanias means that Ukraine has a better chance of taking out Russia's aerial platforms and asserting superiority within its own skies. So it's not just a Russian electronic warfare facility that Ukraine took out on July 26th. Ukraine's drones devastated the storage unit where Russia kept components used to build 3 of its most valuable electronic warfare platforms. Plus, the signal plant's warehouse is ruined, meaning that even if those components were untouched, Russia wouldn't be able to build anything with them. All of this would be bad enough for Putin. His nerve center has just been crippled. But to make matters worse for Russia's leader, the strike on the signal plant isn't the only one that Ukraine conducted. Just a day before the signal attack, Ukraine launched an impressive drone raid that took out a facility Russia used to produce explosive chemicals needed for the manufacture of its bombs. United 24 media says that Ukraine targeted the Nevenomysky Azot chemical plant in the Stavropol region of Russia on July 25th. The head of Ukraine's Center for Countering Disinformation, Andriy Kovalenko, took to Telegram in the wake of the strike, explaining precisely why Ukraine struck the plant. The Nevenomysky nitrogen plant in the Stavropol territory is a manufacturer of chemical raw materials for explosives, in particular nitric acid and ammonium nitrate, Kovalenko explained. It's a key supplier for the production of ammunition, including artillery shells, air bombs, and MLRS. Footage shared by the Xilanova Plus X account reveals that Ukraine's July 25th strike took place at night and that it was extremely effective. One video shows a massive fireball being created by one of Ukraine's drones as it touched down on the Nevenomysky Azot facility, causing smoke to stream into the sky. Another video shared by the channel reveals the sound of Russia's aerial defenses firing and failing to stop Ukraine's drones from hitting their targets. A volley of gunfire is heard, followed by a loud explosion, suggesting a direct hit for Ukraine. What we have here is a 1-2 combo. In 2 days, Ukraine has decimated 2 vital parts of the Russian military supply chain. Here's what all of this means for the Ukraine war moving forward. The most obvious impact of Ukraine's July 26th strike is that Russia is going to have far less access to the jamming equipment it's been using against Ukraine. That's huge for Ukraine. Even back in May 2024, the New York Times was reporting that some of Russia's jamming equipment was powerful enough to send even some of America's best precision-guided missiles off course, making them ineffective on the battlefield for Ukraine. That was a problem. These types of missiles are expensive and in very short supply, meaning Ukraine has to make every single one of them count. Russia's deployment of electronic jamming countermeasures was making those weapons less effective. The impact was enough that an unnamed official inside the US Department of Defense acknowledged it when speaking to the New York Times. "We are very aware of the electronic warfare threat that Russia poses in Ukraine, and that this threat is continually evolving," the official said. As a result, we work closely with Ukraine, along with defense industry partners, to continually assess and provide rapid solutions to these threats, and to help ensure Ukraine remains effective in a very complex EW environment. Ukraine has been countering Russia's electronic warfare by attacking the radar stations and equipment loaded with Russia's jamming equipment. Such was the case in March, when Ukraine's Special Operations Forces distorted a Russian Utyos TM radar. But with the July 26th strike, Ukraine has switched up its strategy to hit Russia's electronic warfare systems at their source, rather than once they're on the battlefield. After all, it's far better to take out the facility that builds these weapons than to expend more ammunition destroying the equipment that uses these weapons once it's out on the battlefield. What the July 26th strike does is put Ukraine one step ahead of Russia on the electronic warfare front. That's vital, as Forbes reporter David Hambling wrote in a March piece in which he claims that Ukrainian lives hang in the balance during what he dubs a deadly electronic warfare arms race. He points out that Ukraine has been deploying vast numbers of jammers and spoofers of its own to prevent Russia from hitting it with its drones, missiles, and glide bombs. By taking out the signal plant, Ukraine has extended the tit-for-tat jamming contest by destroying the very facility Russia relies on to provide so many of its electronic warfare systems. Ultimately, this strike means that more of Ukraine's weapons and countermeasures will hit their targets from now on. Beyond giving Ukraine a leg up on the electronic warfare front, the July 26th strike also reveals something else about Ukraine's strategy. It's focusing as intently as ever before on deep strikes within Russian territory. Ukraine is taking advantage of Russia's massive size to conduct these strikes. United 24 points out that Russia accounts for 11% of the world's landmass at a staggering 6.56 million square miles. While holding onto that much territory is likely a source of pride for Putin, it also creates a problem because a country of this sheer size is incredibly difficult to protect. Russia's air defenses are already stretched thin, thanks to a war that Ukraine's Ministry of Finance says has already claimed 1,201 of Russia's anti-aircraft warfare systems as of July 28th. That stretching creates gaps. It leaves openings for Ukraine's drones and long-range missiles to strike inside Russia's territory with increasing success. What we saw on July 26th was one of the many examples of these deep strikes that have taken place in 2025. And these strikes are costing Russia big, not only in terms of equipment and manufacturing capacity, but also financially. By March of this year, Radio Free Europe was reporting that Ukraine had managed to inflict $714 million of damage against Russia with its deep strikes. That figure was based on a very limited sample size of 100 satellite images covering sites that Ukraine had hit between September 2024 and February 12, 2025. The deep strikes only grew more intense from there. By June 26th, Euromaidan Press was reporting that Ukraine's deep strikes on Russian military targets had cost Putin almost $11 billion between January and May of 2025. About $1.3 billion was accounted for by the direct damage Ukraine has caused to Russia's military and production facilities. However, Euromaidan Press's figures also accounted for indirect costs. Russia had lost $9.5 billion due to shutdowns and supply chain disruptions during the first 5 months of the year. What happened on July 26th only adds to Putin's financial woes. It's yet another in a massive series of deep strikes that Ukraine is using like a dagger plunged directly into the heart of Russia's manufacturing capabilities. Each of these strikes costs Russia money. They limit the effectiveness of Putin's troops on the battlefield, and in the case of the attack at the signal radio plant, to strip away the electronic warfare weapons Russia has relied on so heavily in its invasion of Ukraine. And it's not just manufacturing facilities that Putin has to worry about Ukraine striking. Ukraine is also hitting Russian oil hard. Ukraine just tore out Russia's jugular and is bleeding Russia's oil arteries dry with its deep strike attacks.
In a move that has shocked the world, Ukraine has just launched a daring invasion into Russia, flipping the script on a war that many thought they understood. But this assault didn't come out of nowhere. For months, Ukraine has been meticulously setting the stage with a series of calculated strikes deep into Russian territory. These weren't random attacks, they were precision strikes, each one part of a master plan. With every hit, Ukraine was not only probing Russia's defenses, but also exposing Putin's vulnerabilities for the world to see. These strikes revealed the cracks in Russia's armor, and now, as the world watches in awe, Ukraine's true strategy is revealed, a meticulously crafted plan to strike Russia where it hurts most. Ukrainians consider that Russia did not invade their country in 2022, but nearly 10 years earlier, in 2014, when Russian special forces, the so-called Little Green Men, occupied Crimea and annexed it at the bidding of Russian President Vladimir Putin. At the same time, Russian-armed and Russian-backed separatists, supported by elements of the Russian army and Russian special forces, also occupied parts of the Donetsk and Donbass regions in eastern Ukraine.
A protracted low-intensity conflict began. In February 2022, the Russian army launched a full-scale conventional attack into the rest of Ukraine, aiming at capturing Kyiv, the capital, and decapitating the government. After initial advances, the Russian army was halted amid extremely high numbers of casualties, thousands of troops, armored vehicles, and combat aircraft. The Russian military's inability to conduct rudimentary battlefield tactics, let alone undertake more complex combined arms operations, was exposed. After years of poor investment and corruption, the Russian army was exposed as a hollow shell. Vladimir Putin's three-day special military operation, intended to take Kyiv and bring down the democratically elected Ukrainian government in a lightning strike, is now in its third year. The Russian advance slowed to a crawl and was even forced back in some areas, and then it came to a halt. Artillery barrages have turned woods and forests into splintered wastelands, highly reminiscent of Western France during the First World War. Tank and mechanized infantry forces slug it out. Russian infantry advance hesitantly across no man's land to be targeted by swarms of small drones mounting grenades and RPG rounds. But a stalemate does not win a war. Russia's sheer size, its factory capacity, and its manpower helps to compensate for its high losses. Despite Russia's willingness to expend thousands of its own soldiers in fruitless, suicidal attacks, a long drawn-out war may be working in its favor. The Russian army is slowly beginning to reconstitute itself in ways that the Ukrainian army, with fewer resources and personnel, is struggling to do. In a few weeks, a new Russian spring offensive looks likely. There are some major challenges facing Ukraine as it contemplates a new Russian attack. Artillery shells are running out, soldiers are running out, and much-needed support from international allies seems to be dwindling. Ukraine has gratefully received the M1 Abrams tank and the Bradley infantry fighting vehicles sent by America and a host of other equipment donated by the West, but the numbers are still relatively low. Some critical systems, such as the F-16, have still yet to make it into battle space, despite the conflict being over 2 years old. Is time running out for Ukraine? Last year, there were very high expectations for a Ukrainian counteroffensive once the Ukrainian military had absorbed new Western tanks, artillery, and armored fighting vehicles. But these hopes came to nothing. Artillery, missiles, battlefield drones, trenches, and mines have made the battlefield a harsh and extremely unforgiving environment for either side. Ukrainian mobile forces suffered almost as badly as the Russians. A breakthrough to the coast did not become a reality, and the front lines resumed their static character. But there are still some causes for optimism. The Ukrainian government and military are constantly looking at the best ways to maximize the resources they have, with the emphasis on creativity and initiative as they search for new approaches to defeat the enemy. We'd like to highlight a couple of areas that the Ukrainians are trying to exploit in order to take the war to the Russians, to disrupt their planning and their warfighting capability. Let's talk about the Ukrainian use of long-range drones and the indirect approach to warfare. Since the arrival of air power in the First World War, military commanders have been looking for ways to reach out beyond the front line and into enemy territory to stop enemy men, equipment, and other resources from getting to the battlefield. Far better to stop the guns and render tanks ineffective before they reach the war zone rather than have to expend men and materiel destroying them after they've arrived, right? There are some good examples from the Second World War. The Battle of the Atlantic was an attempt by German submarines to intercept and sink the thousands of tons of troops, tanks, aircraft, ammunition, and food supplies that were coming from America and Canada in order to support Britain and the war effort in Europe. This was a battle of supplies and logistics. Every aircraft in the hold of an Allied merchant ship that the Germans could sink was one less that would be dropping bombs on Hitler's Reich. Faced with the prospect of the severing of Britain's vital transatlantic supply line, British war leader Winston Churchill was reported to have said that the only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril. Similarly, between 1942 and 44, the American Strategic Bombing Force launched raids against the Romanian Ploiești oil refineries in an effort to hamper the delivery of fuel for Germany's industry, aircraft, and panzer forces. Beyond the hedgerows of Normandy after D-Day, Allied aircraft roamed far behind German lines, swooping down on trains, railways, supply dumps, and communication centers. With the bogged-down battlefield in Ukraine, perhaps some of these lessons from history could be turned to Ukraine's favor. Battlefield drones have been around for a long time now. The US military was using surveillance and strike drones, or unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan at the early part of the century. Since then, the use of drones has rapidly expanded, from small, lightweight drones that can carry a grenade to drop into a trench, through to larger systems that can travel hundreds of miles and carry a heavy payload. When Russia's conventional attack struck Ukraine in February 2022, both sides had a range of commercial and military drones at their disposal, some dating back to the Soviet era. One of the newer military drones, particularly popular with the Ukrainian military, is the Turkish TB2 Bayraktar. With a range of around 300 kilometers, it was Ukraine's only purpose-designed armed UAV. The Bayraktar had proven itself already in recent conflicts in Syria and in Azerbaijan. It can fly continuously for 27 hours and carry 4 laser-guided weapons. The Bayraktar was to become so well received based on its ability to destroy Russian armor that a pop song about it was written in Ukrainian, and there are even reports that children and family pets were named after it. With the critical conditions of war acting as an incentive, Ukrainian drone designers have taken this initial capability several steps further. Much of their early design and development work was amateur and improvised, manufactured at small scale in a basement or a workshop. They were often based on commercial quadcopters that could be bought in a hobby shop or online, or from off-the-shelf systems from China. As Russian bombs and missiles indiscriminately pounded civilian targets and urban areas across Ukraine, Ukrainian military planners were starting to look beyond the immediate front line and consider other ways of taking the war to Russia and disrupting the Russian war effort. With necessity being the mother of invention, Ukrainian forces were soon able to increase their drone attack capabilities and numbers. But Ukraine has been operating under political and humanitarian constraints that are not faced by Russia. The Ukrainian government has been at pains to avoid indiscriminate targeting of civilian sites. Furthermore, Western countries backing Ukraine and providing weapons, equipment, vehicles, and ammunition have been concerned that the weapon systems they provide should not be used to take the war into Russia. This is why specific long-range NATO missile systems, artillery pieces, and combat aircraft have either been slow to arrive or have still not yet been made available to the Ukrainian military. This has meant that the long-range drones that Ukraine can produce and operate themselves with fewer restrictions have taken on a higher prominence in the war. In early 2024, Ukrainian Commander Major General Vadim Skibitsky was absolutely clear why the long-range drone campaign was critical to the Ukrainian way of waging war. He said that Ukraine had no choice. He said that victory on the battlefield was no longer possible in the face of Russian military superiority and the Ukrainian deficiencies in artillery shells and combat aircraft. It was essential instead to hit Russian targets beyond the front line, including infrastructure, command centers, and factories. So let's take a look at how the Ukrainian armed forces have been striking back and taking the war into Russia with aerial drones. Remember that it's not always easy to assess whether a particular explosion, fire, or incident is due to a drone. Both sides have been very cautious with information, and disinformation rules the airwaves. There have been many explosive incidents a few kilometers inside Russia. These are just as likely to be connected with artillery, airstrikes, sabotage, small arms fire, or other methods of attacks than they are linked to drones. However, as we get further away from the border and deeper into Russia, it's easier to see the work of drones. On the 22nd of June 2022, the first reports of a possible drone attack in Russia came in. An explosion at the oil refinery at Novosibirsk was attributed to a suicide drone. The refinery was around 150 kilometers from the front line and was believed to have been struck by a Mugin 5 drone, which according to the company website, the commercial version is made of lightweight carbon fiber, has a flight time of 7 hours and can carry a payload of 25 kilograms. Because the earlier drones that were available to the Ukrainian military could only carry relatively light payloads, the planners and the drone operators had to put a high premium on good reconnaissance and intelligence for each mission. It was crucial to understand where the weakest link was in a large target such as a refinery, for example a crucial generator, in order to take it offline with a small but precise strike. Drone attacks were certainly not going to resemble the British and American saturation bombing raids of late World War II. Other reports began to come in of explosions across Russia. On Friday evening of 19th of August, Russian media sources reported drone attacks across in Crimea, other Russian-held parts of Ukraine, and also in Russia, with Russian air defense systems very active. These attacks were still relatively close to Ukraine, but that was to change as the year wore on. Early December 2022, as Russian air and missile strikes were pounding the Ukrainian energy network in an effort to freeze the country, explosions rocked 3 Russian military air bases across western Russia at Kursk, Saratov, and Ryazan. Saratov, the most distant target, is over 700 kilometers away from Ukraine, and Ryazan Air Base, home of Russian heavy bomber aircraft, is only 180 kilometers from Moscow. Let's have a think about what sort of targets the drones were being used against, and what sort of intentions the Ukrainian leadership had when they authorized such attacks. Inevitably and understandably, Ukrainian senior commanders are tight-lipped about their strategies and intentions, but a wide spread of Russian targets are being hit. Almost all of these are either directly military targets or are sites that closely support Russia's military operations, including air bases, oil refineries, drone factories, railways, ships and naval bases, and steel plants. From this we can see that Ukrainian intentions are to strike out beyond the enemy tanks and troops on the front line and hit the strategic assets that power the Russian war machine: air power, transportation, fuel and factories. But many of these drone strikes serve a dual role: to strike at the military, but also to serve as a propaganda victory and to boost the morale of the home front. On Wednesday, 3rd of May 2023, 2 explosions struck the Kremlin, Russia's symbolic heart of government, and the Moscow base of President Vladimir Putin. Grainy video footage captured the 2 small-scale incidents. It does seem likely that 2 drones were employed, but the debate still rages on, distorted by misinformation on both sides. US officials, better placed than you or I to judge the situation, quickly came to the conclusion that the Ukrainians were likely behind the attacks. Russia claimed to have defeated the attack and immediately accused the Ukrainians of trying to assassinate Putin. Ukrainian President Zelensky denied that the attack came from Ukraine, but the incident had a big psychological impact, coming as it did on the anniversary of the 9th of May Victory Parade, when the Russian army was planning to drive through Red Square in the center of Moscow and celebrate victory over Nazi Germany during the Second World War. The message was very clear: Russia is certainly not safe from attack, and that Ukrainian capability was growing by the day. The Ukrainian ability to project drones into Russia continued to evolve, making improvements in size, scale, and capacity. At least one senior Ukrainian commander was heard to boast that they can fly to Moscow and back. The 12-mile-long Russian-built Kerch Bridge, built between 2016 and 2020 after Russia illegally annexed Crimea, links Crimea to Russia. For Ukrainians, it's always been a provocative symbol of the Russian invasion. The bridge has been attacked 3 times since the invasion in February 2022, but not yet by drone. If the bridge could be destroyed, it would be a major propaganda victory for Ukraine and a major disruption to supplies coming into Crimea. Ukrainian intelligence officials have been dropping strong hints that a drone attack against the bridge might also be a course of action they're considering. One Ukrainian official reportedly declared that the bridge will be attacked in the first half of 2024, so we might not have to wait long before we find out. But this might simply be a clever deception operation to keep Russia guessing and forcing it to spread its defensive assets even more thinly and in all directions. In 2023, Ukrainian drone attacks surged. A BBC report in September showed that the strikes were increasing in frequency and range. President Zelensky was less secretive about the use of drones over Russian territory, describing them as an inevitable, natural, and absolutely fair process. The BBC study concluded that there had been over 190 drone attacks into Russia and Russian-held Crimea in 9 months. There has also been no let-up in 2024. In fact, there was something of a surge in drone attacks in the build-up to the Russian presidential election in March. CNN reported that a wave of 36 drones were launched to coincide with the last day of voting. On the 2nd of April, 2024, Ukrainian drones hit an oil refinery and a drone factory in a Russian industrial area some 1,300 kilometers away from Ukraine. But how effective have these attacks into Russia actually been? Well, we have seen how important the attacks can be for Ukrainian morale, and the drone attacks have certainly put the spotlight on the effectiveness, or otherwise, of Russian air defenses. Firstly, it has meant that Russian defenses have had to be recalled from frontline duty and positioned to protect strategic targets further back in Russia. Secondly, despite the Russian media claims, it seems highly likely that Russian homeland air defenses are performing extremely poorly. Russian strategic air defenses have had a poor reputation for decades. The younger viewers might need to Google this gentleman, Mr. Matthias Rust. He was an exceptionally naive young man who, aged 19 in 1987, at the height of the Cold War, decided to fly his civilian 4-seat Cessna Skyhawk aircraft from Germany to Moscow via Finland in a gesture of peace and friendship. Incredibly, although he should have been shot down immediately, he was entirely untroubled by the layers of Russian ground and air-based defenses throughout his flight. He was certainly noticed a couple of times, but the command and control system responsible for tracking was incoherent and confused. When he landed in Red Square in Moscow, it was an appalling embarrassment for the Soviet leadership. The fate of the senior Soviet air defense commanders can only be imagined. And so fast forward to 2024. In April, a Carnegie report assessed Russian anti-drone air defenses as inept, noting that large, slow-moving Ukrainian drones could still float in over the target in broad daylight, choosing their aiming point and approach route carefully and not be at any significant risk.
On 5th of April, a particularly successful drone strike hit Rostov military air base, reportedly destroying at least 6 aircraft. The drone attacks against Russian oil production and refining capability look to be intensifying. Fuel and oil are crucial to the Russian war effort and also to civilian life, but the debate about the value of small attacks against refineries and plants is still ongoing. The majority of Russian refining capability is way to the east, beyond the Ural Mountains, and realistically is still well out of reach of drones. Putin has prioritized fuel for the military, even if it means hardship for Russian civilians. The damage caused by drones is still relatively small and repairs can be made quickly. Most refineries damaged in a drone strike are usually up and running again within a couple of weeks. But other analysts are more upbeat about the impact. The Economist, a political analytical journal, has claimed that the Ukrainian drone attacks have knocked out a seventh, around 14%, of Russian oil refining capability in total, and that the single attack on the refinery on April 2nd accounted for 3% of capacity. Although Ukraine struggles to sustain waves of attacks died down after the Russian presidential elections, the overall impact of attacks on Russian refineries is significant. The attacks are forcing Russia to take some very expensive and highly public measures to protect its fuel assets, including banning petrol exports, importing fuel from Belarus, and also asking Kazakhstan for assistance. This shows that Russia is experiencing some discomfort from the attacks. Both The Economist and the Carnegie analysts conclude that at present, Ukraine can make and fire drones at Russian refineries at a faster rate than Russia can repair the damage. But there's more. Let's take a look at another aspect of the strategic drone war. Ukraine has next to no navy. Its one frigate was deliberately sunk by the navy to stop it falling into Russian hands. But Ukraine has reinvented naval warfare almost single-handedly by turning to seaborne drones as a means of attacking Russian ships, ports, and naval installations. 6 suicide drones filled with explosives and piloted remotely were reportedly used for the first time in October 2022 as they attempted to ram Russian warships in Sevastopol harbor. This attack is believed to have seriously damaged the frigate Admiral Makarov, the flagship of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, and a minesweeper, the Ivan Golubets. Russian anti-drone defenses, often little more than men armed with machine guns on the decks of their ships, have struggled to find a solution to the threat from very small and fast-moving vessels, often moving at night. The Ukrainians claim to have sunk at least 5 Russian ships with sea drones. These drones have conducted multiple operations around the Black Sea, and now Ukraine can justifiably claim to have the world's first fleet of naval drones. The Magura 5 naval drone is a good example of this new evolution in naval warfare. It's designed like a small motorboat that sits low in the water. It's hard to spot by the naked eye, is made of plastic to avoid radar detection, and does not give off much heat, which thwarts thermal cameras. The Ukrainian commander of a sea drone unit notes that when Russians fire at the drones with tracer rounds, it makes it easier to see where the Russians are firing from and allows evasion measures. Its performance is impressive. With a payload of up to 320 kilograms, it has a range of 800 kilometers and can travel at up to 80 kilometers per hour. The capability of these drones is improving month by month, and the strategic impact of a relatively small number of drones on the Russian Navy has been incredible. The Russians have effectively retreated from the Black Sea and have now pulled back the bulk of the Black Sea fleet hundreds of kilometers east to the port of Novorossiysk on the eastern coast of the Black Sea. Impartial analysts and Ukrainians alike have declared that Ukraine is winning the battle for the Black Sea. With the Russian Navy seemingly no longer willing to contest the Black Sea, this protects Ukraine's southern flank from amphibious attacks, puts Russian-held Crimea in a precarious position, and allows Ukraine to export grain out into the Mediterranean for much-needed revenue. It's clear that Ukraine is achieving military wonders with limited resources but a lot of creative thinking. Although a small fleet of air and sea drones is still unlikely to be a war winner, Ukraine is scoring major military and propaganda victories. But Russia still has a lot of resources, and the situation on the front lines recently appears to be shifting in favor of Russia. Drones are no substitute for artillery shells, modern tanks, and fighter aircraft.
About 470 miles away from Ukraine's border with Russia lies Arzamas. Nestled in the Nizhny Novgorod Oblast, Arzamas is home to a component manufacturing plant that produces systems used in some of Russia's most powerful missiles. No components means no missiles, making the plant an obvious target for Ukraine. Distance isn't an issue. How do we know? Ukraine has just obliterated one of Russia's most important strategic factories with a deep strike blast. Even the Russians don't know how Ukraine managed to pull this off, but they do know that they'll have far fewer missiles with which to hit Ukraine in the future. Euromaidan Press was among the first media outlets to report on the strike, writing on August 11th, The Ukrainian drones managed to score direct hits on the Arzamas instrument-making plant the night before. Ukraine made sure it launched the attack in the dead of night, with News Sky reporting that the first reports of incoming drones were made at around 1:30 a.m. There are two purposes behind such late-night strikes. First, moving under the cover of darkness makes Ukraine's drones much harder to detect. They can still be spotted by radar, assuming they fly within a radar system's coverage area. However, people on the ground struggle to see the drones until it's far too late, eliminating a potential early warning system that would allow Russia to prepare for Ukraine's drone attacks. As for the second reason, that's far more devastating to the collective Russian psyche. Ukraine hits hard during the early hours to make sure civilians have to wake up and see the war Vladimir Putin started landing on their doorstep. Of course, Ukraine isn't hitting civilian locations directly. That's a distinctly Russian tactic that Putin has used to create terror in Ukraine's cities since he launched his invasion. Rather, Ukraine hits legitimate military targets that just happen to be close enough to Russian cities to force air raid sirens to blare and warnings to be delivered. Every strike like the one we've just seen in Arzamas is a reminder to Russia's people that their country is not only at war, but fighting against a nation that has the ability to strike deep inside Russia. News Sky reports that the first loud sounds resembling explosions came from the Arzamas factory at about 2 a.m., with most seeming to come from the direction of the facility's warehouses. Flashes of fire, heavy smoke, the telltale hum of incoming drones, all were reported by the Arzamas residents who were awoken by the strike. Local air defenses activated to try to take Ukraine's drones down. They may have succeeded a handful of times, but News Sky says that at least 2 of the drones broke through Russia's defenses to deliver their explosive payloads to the components factory. The strike will leave Russia questioning just how Ukraine managed to pull it off. The Arzamas plant was supposed to be safe. Around 470 miles behind the border, it was meant to be far enough away for Russian air defenses to respond early to any incoming threat. But as has been so often the case over the last few months, Ukraine's drones found their way through and hit their target. News Sky speculates that Ukraine used at least 2 types of drones in the strike. The first appears to be a UJ-22 airborne model, which is capable of carrying up to 44 pounds of explosives and can travel over 500 miles, according to the manufacturer, enough range to hit the Arzamas plant. The second drone is believed to be a moped-style, first-person view or FPV drone that followed up on the initial drone strike. So it seems like the UJ-22s had the job of destroying the walls of the Arzamas facility, with the FPV drones that followed being directed to specific targets inside the facility Ukraine wanted. Those drones were successful, News Sky says, as Ukraine carried out the strike from multiple directions. That made tracking all of the incoming drones difficult for Russia's already stretched air defenses. In addition to giving Ukraine a failsafe, if one drone hole was shot down, which appears to be the case, then the other could still hit the factory. That's exactly what happened, and the results are devastating for Russia's war effort. Ukraine has confirmed that the strike took place and that its drones hit their target. Speaking to the Ukrainian outlet Hromadske, an SBU source has confirmed that it was in fact 4, not 2, drones that hit their targets in Arzamas during the early hours of August 11th. The enterprises of the Russian military-industrial complex, which are working for the war against Ukraine, are absolutely legitimate military targets, the source told Hromadske. The SBU continues to work on the demilitarization of facilities that produce weapons for terror in peaceful Ukrainian cities, and we don't need to take that source's word for it, as video has already surfaced of Ukraine's drones doing their damage. Published by the Euromaidan Press X account, several videos showcase both the strike in progress and its aftermath. One of the videos shows smoke pouring out of a window of the Arzamas facility, at least for a few seconds. Suddenly, a massive explosion rocks the building, setting off car alarms in the process, while engulfing the side of the factory in a massive fireball. Perhaps it was one of the follow-up FPV drones hitting their target after a gap had been created. We don't know for sure. Other videos, shared by Euromaidan Press, show one of Ukraine's drones descending on the factory, and the aftermath of the strike, as fires blaze inside and on top of the component manufacturing facility. The evidence is in, and it's undeniable. Ukraine scored several direct hits on one of Russia's most vital factories. Of course, evidence being undeniable doesn't mean that Russia is going to admit that one of its factories has gone up in flames. The only comment provided by Russia so far is provided by the Arzamas regional governor, Gleb Nikitin, who has confirmed that a strike took place. Nikitin stopped very short of stating that Ukraine had scored direct hits, however. Last night, an attack by the enemy was carried out on 2 industrial zones in the Nizhny Novgorod Oblast. Their targets were our industrial enterprises, Nikitin said. Specialists are currently working on site. The mayor of Arzamas, Alexander Shkolokov, is coordinating the situation, and necessary work is being organized together with the plant management. That's a little more than we usually get from Russia. It has at least acknowledged that Ukraine tried to hit an industrial facility, but rather than confirming the success of Ukraine's drone assault, Nikitin instead claimed that 1 worker was killed and 2 more were injured in the attack. That's an admission in its own right, even if Nikitin didn't intend it to be. After all, how could these workers have been killed if Ukraine's drones hadn't penetrated the factory in which they were working? They couldn't. This leads us to the obvious question of why, out of all the factories that enable Russia's brutal war, was the Arzamas plant chosen in the first place? One of the reasons is that the plant is among the most innovative and impressive in all of Russia. Euromaidan Press says that Astra has revealed that the plant is among the leading enterprises of Russia's defense industrial complex, and it has been for a while. About 20% of the facility is owned by the Almaz anti-air defense concern, which is a Russian company that's under sanctions from the US and Europe. So there's a clear and direct link to Putin's war effort. As for innovation, the plant has received Russia's Golden Idea Award in 2020, in recognition of the equipment it was building and its willingness to cooperate with Russia's military. A pat on the head from Putin tells us that Russia's leader places a great deal of value on this factory. Why wouldn't he? The Arzamas plant makes a whole bunch of components that are vital to Russia's war effort, ranging from gyroscopic instruments and onboard computers to control systems and steering mechanisms. You might recognize some of those components as being vital parts of the missiles that Russia is launching at Ukraine regularly, and wouldn't you just know it? The SBU says that its drones specifically targeted the parts of the Arzamas facility that are responsible for making and storing components used in Russia's X-32 and X-101 cruise missiles. That's according to the SBU source who spoke to Hromadska at least. But that's far from all that the plant makes. News Sky says that components from the plant are also used in Russia's air defense systems and the communications equipment built into its drones and aircraft. All told, up to 30% of what the Arzamas plant builds serves the needs of Russia's military, making the factory key to Russia's attempts to modernizing its fighting force to deal with far more technologically savvy Ukrainians. What we have here is a case of Ukraine being very careful about how it chooses its targets. Any strike on the Arzamas plant would have represented an impressive victory for Ukraine. There is almost an embarrassment of riches to choose from when it comes to what the plant makes and the impact the facility has on the war. Ukraine also knew that only a few of its drones were going to make it through Russia's defenses, so it chose carefully. And we now know that Ukraine specifically hit part of the plant that makes components for some of Russia's most dangerous missiles. The X-32, also known as the Kh-32, is a dangerous enough missile in its own right. An upgrade over Russia's older Kh-22 missiles, according to Army recognition. The missile has a range of up to 621 miles. That means Russia has been able to launch it from well behind the front lines without risking its aircraft in Ukrainian territory. Russia was planning to start equipping the missile with cluster munitions back in January 2024, Army recognition says, and it's likely that work has been completed by now. We also know that the X-32 is a supersonic missile, meaning it's fast enough to exceed the speed of sound. As for the X-101, also known as the Kh-101, that's one of the most dangerous missiles in Russia's arsenal. The X-101 variant holds a conventional warhead weighing up to 992 pounds, missile threat reports, though there's also a version of the same missile, named the Kh-102, that can carry a nuclear warhead. Throw a 1,739-mile range into the mix, and that missile would be almost impossible for Ukraine to hit directly, even with its best long-range drones. So Ukraine didn't target the missiles directly. It hit the factory that is responsible for ensuring that those missiles have the components they need to reach their targets. That's the genius of Ukraine's strategy. Russia's goal is to make as many of these missiles as possible before spreading them out far and wide across its own territory. That creates obvious problems for Ukraine. Rather than hitting a centralized storage unit, it would have to locate and strike potentially dozens of facilities and air bases across Russia to take out its stockpiles of these. An almost impossible task. It's much smarter to take out the one major facility that builds the navigational components these missiles need. Russia will still be able to build its X-32s and X-101s, but without the vital components being made at the Arzamas plant, those missiles are functionally useless. They become explosive duds that Russia can't use to attack Ukraine, and that brings us to what the Arzamas plant strike means in the wider context of the war. You see, this is far from the first example of Ukraine taking an indirect approach to tackling the problem of Putin trying to expand his war machine. Ukraine long ago realized that it would be onto a losing idea if it solely attacked Russia's ammunition stockpiles. Russia could always make more. Instead, Ukraine is now engaged in a campaign of systematic degradation of what can best be described as the behind-the-scenes workings of Russia's military. The goal is still to weaken Russia's forces on the front lines. That will never change. But now, Ukraine is doing that weakening by depriving Russia of the ability to build and fund the weapons the country's military needs to do significant damage to Ukraine. As Euromaidan Press puts it, Ukraine conducts drone attacks against Russia to systematically degrade Russian military capabilities and disrupt the war effort through targeted strikes on strategic infrastructure. Air bases, oil refineries, factories, they are all targets in this systematic degradation, because they all help to fuel Russia's operations in the air and on the front lines. The Arzamas strike is just the latest example of that degradation theory being put into devastating practice by Ukraine. We've also seen plenty of evidence that Ukraine's approach is working. Back on March 29th, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, or RFE-RL, published an article that revealed that analysis of over 100 satellite images gathered from September 2024 to February 25 showed that Ukraine had hit dozens of Russian military facilities during that period. All told, the damage caused was estimated at $714 million. But it's not the economic aspect that is Ukraine's main concern. Ukraine wants to hurt Russia's military. Up to 160,000 tons of Russian ammunition were destroyed during that 6-month period that RFE-RL tracked. Oil and gas facilities were hit 27 times, causing 97 storage tanks to be destroyed or damaged. And with Ukraine's factory attacks, we see a clear effort to destroy Russia's ability to build weapons that are doing the most damage to Ukraine. Bearing in mind that RFE-RL's figures come from a single 6-month period, about the same amount of time has passed since those figures were published, so it's safe to assume that many more tons of ammo, components, and oil have gone up in flames since. The Carnegie Endowment introduced an interesting concept that could provide Ukraine with a path to victory in a June 2025 article. Dubbed strategic neutralization, the idea is that Ukraine avoids trying to bring Russia to the negotiating table or force its military into an attritional battle that slowly grinds away at Russia's resources. Instead, Ukraine should make the war functionally unwinnable from a Russian perspective. It aims to paralyze Russia's ability to achieve any military success, not by defeating it in full, but by making the pursuit of its goals unworkable and futile in practice, the Carnegie Endowment says. The strategy recognizes that functional defeat, where a military capability is not completely destroyed but rendered irrelevant, is both a repeatable and scalable outcome that Ukraine has already achieved in multiple cases. Denying function rather than depleting volume lies at the core of this theory. The Arzamas strike fits right into this strategic neutralization idea. Just as Ukraine managed to neutralize Russia's Black Sea threat by taking out a third of the Black Sea fleet with missiles and drones, it's now trying to do the same to Russia's missiles. Simply absorbing those missiles while Russia runs out isn't going to cut it. Making it harder and harder for Russia to build those missiles to the point where it's disadvantageous for Russia to even try could be the end goal. And achieving that goal can't come soon enough from the Ukrainian perspective. Hitting the Arzamas plant serves a more immediate strategic function than the long-term plan of neutralization. Ukraine needs to stop Russia from launching as many missiles as it has been launching, ideally as soon as possible. While it's difficult to find figures on how many missiles Russia has fired against Ukraine in recent months, we do have a figure from earlier in the year, courtesy of the Kyiv Independent. It quoted Ukraine's Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha on April 11th, who said, "From March 11th to April 11th, Russia shot at Ukraine almost 70 missiles of various types, over 2,200 Shahid drones, and over 6,000 guided aerial bombs. 70 missiles in a month works out to between 2 and 3 missiles per day. It's relatively safe to assume that Russia has been keeping up these numbers ever since, and that's a massive concern for Ukraine. Drones are one thing. Packed with explosives, a drone can punch a hole in a building or kill small groups of civilians. However, missiles are far more powerful, packing a punch so massive they can take out multiple buildings if they hit home. The X-32s and X-101s at the Arzamas factory played a key role in making functional, are also among Russia's most damaging. Taking out the plant means slowing down Russia's production of those missiles. We may not see the effects for another couple of months, but when Russia runs low on its existing stockpiles, Ukraine will get a breather from these particular missiles because its August 11th drone strike took out the components needed to make them. Creating that situation is especially important for Ukraine because it still doesn't have enough of the modern air defense systems that it needs to fully protect its largest cities from Russia's missiles. Calls for more of these systems are common and are often led by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. As far back as April 2024, Politico reported that Zelensky was claiming that at least 25 more US-made Patriot air defense systems were needed to make Ukraine's skies as safe as possible from Russian missiles. Fast forward a little over a year and Zelensky was still calling for more air defenses. Patriots and their missiles are real defenders of life, Zelensky said in the wake of a July missile attack on Kyiv that left 23 Ukrainians injured and at least 1 killed. It's very important to maintain the support of partners in ballistic missile defense. Clearly, air defense is an area of the war in which Ukraine is still struggling. And though Ukraine now has a promise from US President Donald Trump to help it source more modern systems, we don't know precisely what that means yet. All the more reason for strikes like the August 11th attack on the Arzamas factory. That drone assault isn't going to destroy Russia's missile stockpile, but as we've already mentioned, it will limit Russia's ability to build at least a couple of types of missile that have devastated Ukraine in the past. It's all about buying time for more air defenses to arrive. and time for Ukraine's cities and troops as the country continues its strategy of deep strikes designed to disable Russia's war machine once and for all. The Arzamas facility is far from the only key Russian factory Ukraine has taken out in recent days. In Tatarstan, Ukraine just obliterated a Russian factory of terror responsible for pumping out thousands of Russia's long-range Shahid drones. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to the Military Show for more coverage of Ukraine's latest deep strikes against Russia. And thank you for watching.